Every serious study of the Ardennes offensive eventually arrives at the same uncomfortable arithmetic. The German plan requires its armored spearheads to capture Allied fuel dumps along the route of advance within the first 72 hours, because the offensive carries insufficient gasoline in its own supply train to reach the Meuse River on organic reserves alone. That dependency is not a contingency buried in a footnote. It is written into the operational planning as an explicit assumption. The panzers will seize what they cannot carry. When that assumption fractures against American resistance that holds the fuel dumps long enough to either defend or destroy them, the entire offensive begins eroding from the inside before Allied counterattacks apply pressure from the outside. The Tiger II tank that anchors the German armored punch in the Ardennes weighs 69 tons and burns approximately 8 gallons of gasoline per mile on roads, considerably more cross-country through the frozen Belgian terrain the offensive must cross. A single Tiger II traveling 100 miles consumes roughly 800 gallons. Multiply that across the armored formations of the 6th SS Panzer Army and the 5th Panzer Army committed to the offensive, and the daily fuel requirement for sustained armored movement runs into hundreds of thousands of gallons. The German supply train assembled for the Ardennes offensive carries approximately 4 consumption units of fuel for the entire attacking force, enough for roughly 150 to 200 kilometers of movement under ideal conditions. The distance from the start line to Antwerp, the operation's strategic objective, is approximately 200 miles. The math does not work without captured fuel. It never worked without captured fuel. German planners understand this and build the capture assumption into the timetable. Kampfgruppe Piper, the armored spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper, is specifically tasked with advancing at maximum speed toward fuel dumps known to exist at Bühlingen, Stabilo, and Spa. Piper's force carries roughly 600 tons of fuel at the offensive's opening, enough for approximately 2 days of aggressive movement. The dumps he is racing toward hold collectively an estimated 2 million gallons of Allied gasoline. 2 million gallons, sitting in storage containers along the route of a German armored thrust, represents the difference between an offensive that reaches the Meuse and one that stalls in the Ardennes. Piper's column on the opening days of the offensive moves with a violence and speed that briefly suggests the timetable might hold. His force, roughly 800 vehicles including Tiger II tanks, Panther tanks at 45 tons, half-tracks, and support vehicles, pushes through the Losheim Gap and drives west along roads that were never engineered for armored traffic at this weight and density. The lead Tiger II, weighing 69 tons, grinds road surfaces into broken gravel under tracks designed for cross-country operation. Behind it, the column stretches for miles, burning fuel continuously as vehicles idle in the traffic compression that the narrow Ardennes road network produces within hours of the offensive beginning. Inside one of those stalled vehicles somewhere in the column, the driver watches the fuel gauge needle and says nothing, because saying something changes nothing. The engine idles at roughly 400 revolutions per minute, burning gasoline at a rate that empties the tank whether the vehicle moves or sits. Every hour of idling in a traffic jam is fuel that does not carry the vehicle 1 meter closer to the Meuse. At Bühlingen on December 17th, Piper's force seizes an American fuel dump containing approximately 50,000 gallons of aviation gasoline. The column stops, and German tank crews spend time pumping aviation fuel into vehicles designed to burn motor gasoline, because the alternative is leaving the tanks where they sit. Aviation gasoline runs in Panzer engines with reduced efficiency and potential long-term mechanical stress, but it burns. It moves vehicles. Piper takes it and pushes west. The Stabilo dump is larger and more critical. American forces hold Stabilo long enough on December 18th to prevent Piper from seizing the primary fuel storage there, a depot holding an estimated 124,000 gallons. When American defenders finally withdraw, they leave the dump intact, but Piper's window to exploit it has closed as American forces counterattack to retake the town. The column that needed those 124,000 gallons to sustain its advance toward the Meuse crosses the Amblev River at Stavelot and keeps moving on diminishing reserves, hoping the next objective produces what this one failed to deliver. It does not. Piper reaches Stumont and La Glaise, having outrun both his fuel supply and his infantry support. The column that was supposed to be the fastest-moving armored spearhead in the offensive sits in the Amblev Valley with tanks that cannot move far enough to escape encirclement because the fuel state will not support the maneuver distance required. Piper radios for resupply. The response that comes back through the command chain describes a fuel convoy attempting to reach his position. That convoy, carrying roughly enough fuel to give his armored force limited operational movement, is attacked by American forces and never reaches La Glaise. The 6th SS Panzer Army's broader advance stalls for compounding reasons that all trace back to the same route. The road network in its attack sector collapses under the traffic density of multiple divisions attempting to move simultaneously through the same narrow Ardennes corridors. A single destroyed vehicle, a tank with a mechanical failure, a truck with a bomb crater underneath it, blocks the entire column behind it because the roads have no viable bypass routes through the Belgian forest terrain. Engineers brought forward to clear obstacles burn time and fuel, while armored columns idle behind them. The fuel consumption of idling engines in stalled columns represents a catastrophic waste that the supply arithmetic cannot absorb. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army to the south makes better initial progress precisely because it uses different tactics. Infantry attacks opening routes before armor commits, reducing the traffic concentration problem by sequencing the advance more carefully. The 2nd Panzer Division from Manteuffel's army reaches a point within approximately 4 miles of the Meuse River near Dinant before it too stalls, its lead elements running dry with the river visible from the forward positions. 4 miles from the Meuse, the objective that the entire offensive is designed to cross. Stalled not by Allied armor or artillery, but by empty fuel tanks. The 2nd Panzer Division's forward elements sit beside Belgian roads within sight of their strategic objective for 2 days, while the fuel convoys that might have moved them those final 4 miles are either delayed by road congestion, destroyed by Allied air attack, or simply consumed by the vehicles further back in the column that burn through their reserves before the front of the line receives its allocation. Allied air power compounds the fuel crisis exponentially once the weather breaks on December 23rd. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, carrying 500-pound bombs and rockets, begin working the Ardennes road network with a systematic intensity that the German supply convoys cannot survive in daylight. A fuel truck carrying drums of gasoline is among the most destructive targets an aircraft can hit. The secondary explosions from burning fuel can destroy adjacent vehicles and crater road surfaces simultaneously. German supply officers recalibrate convoys to night movement, but the Ardennes road network at night, in winter, with blackout conditions, moves supplies at a fraction of the speed the offensive's consumption rate requires. Every gallon that burns in an air attack is a gallon that does not reach a tank sitting with its engine running somewhere in the Belgian forest. Something that I kept returning to while working through the German quartermaster records from the Ardennes offensive was the specificity of the fuel allocation arguments between Army headquarters. 5th Panzer Army and 6th SS Panzer Army are essentially competing for the same finite supply, and the allocation decisions made at Army Group B level reflect a prioritization logic that gets revised repeatedly as the operational picture changes. Reading those documents, you understand that the fuel crisis is not a single catastrophic moment of running dry. It is a progressive erosion across 10 days of an offensive that was already undersupplied at its opening and burns through its reserves faster than any optimistic planning scenario projected. By Christmas, the offensive has fractured into a collection of isolated armored groups defending ground they cannot exploit because the fuel to maneuver no longer exists in the quantities movement requires. Piper abandons his vehicles at La Glaise on December 24th, destroying approximately 30 Tiger II tanks, dozens of Panthers, half-tracks, and artillery pieces, rather than leave them operational for American forces to capture. Crews walk out through the Ardennes forest on foot. The vehicles that were supposed to drive to Antwerp sit burning in a Belgian village because nobody could get enough gasoline to them in time. The German offensive does not lose the Battle of the Bulge exclusively to Allied soldiers, tanks, and aircraft. It loses it to the weight of its own armored vehicles, measured against the fuel-carrying capacity of a road network that was never adequate for the operational concept built on top of it. If the night is quiet around you now, and you are somewhere warm, picture a Tiger II tank sitting beside a Belgian road in the Ardennes forest on a December night. 69 tons of steel, a cannon capable of fracturing the armor of any Allied tank at combat range, a crew of 5 men who have been fighting for 10 days. The fuel gauge reads empty. The Meuse River is somewhere to the west. It might as well be on the other side of the world. This is the entire history of the fuel crisis at the Bulge, why the Panzers stopped during the Second World War. Chapter 1. The Empty Tank. A war already lost on paper. Albert Speer was 36 years old when Fritz Todt died in a plane crash on the morning of 8 February 1942, and he was appointed Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production before the day was out. The appointment was, on its surface, improbable. Speer was an architect, trained at Karlsruhe, then Munich, then Berlin under Heinrich Tessenow, and he'd built his entire reputation designing stages and symbols for a party that confused spectacle with strategy. But Hitler trusted him, and in the Third Reich, that was a career qualification that outweighed almost everything else. What the appointment actually gave Germany was something stranger than a propaganda win. It gave the Wehrmacht a minister who understood industrial systems, who could read a production table and trace its logic backward to a raw material supply chain, and who would eventually become the only senior figure in the regime keeping genuinely honest numbers. That last quality, the honesty about numbers, is the reason Speer matters to this story before a single panzer crosses the Ardennes start line. By the summer of 1944, the numbers were catastrophic. Speer's ministry had watched the Allied bombing campaign shift its priorities in May of that year, and the shift was not abstract to him. It was personal, immediate, and alarming in a way that very few other people in the German leadership were willing to acknowledge. The Leuna chemical plant at Merseburg, 50 kilometers west of Leipzig, was the largest synthetic fuel facility in the Reich, a site 3.5 kilometers long and over a kilometer wide, employing more than 35,000 workers and producing somewhere in the region of 600,000 tons of synthetic fuel products per year by 1943. On 12 May 1944, 232 American heavy bombers attacked it for the first time. The plant was damaged. Production dropped sharply, and within a week, Speer told Hitler directly that if the Allies persisted in attacking the oil infrastructure, Germany would, in his words, soon no longer have any fuel production worth mentioning. He was not being theatrical. He was reading the output tables. What Speer recorded in his memoirs about that May attack has been quoted often. He wrote that he shall never forget the date May 12th, and that on that day the technological war was decided. But what the memoirs cannot convey, and what the production archives from the Saxony-Anhalt State Archive do convey, is the granular horror of what followed. The Leuna workforce, 35,000 people, nearly 10,000 of them forced laborers working under conditions that Speer's own ministry had helped impose, began emergency repair operations within hours of each bombing raid. They were skilled workers, many of them career chemical engineers and plant technicians from IG Farben, the industrial conglomerate that had built Leuna in the first place. They knew the plant's systems the way a surgeon knows anatomy, and they repaired the damage. That is the part of this story that almost no account makes enough of. Germany did not lose the synthetic fuel war because its engineers failed. It lost because the Allied bombing campaign was timed precisely to prevent those engineers from ever finishing a repair cycle before the next raid arrived. The process at the heart of Leuna was high-pressure coal hydrogenation, a three-stage sequence that began with the conversion of brown coal, air, and water into hydrogen, nitrogen, and carbon monoxide gases, proceeded through purification and compression to around 300 atmospheres, and concluded in the synthesis reactors where those gases were combined with catalysts under temperatures of 450 to 500 degrees Celsius to produce synthetic fuel. The equipment required to sustain those pressures and temperatures was custom fabricated, capital-intensive, and irreplaceable on any short timeline. The Saxony-Anhalt archive holds Luna's 22 weekly damage and repair reports from July through December 1944, and reading them is an experience that sits somewhere between admiration and dread. Each entry describes specific reactor vessels, specific utility lines, specific sections of the plant's 240 kilometers of internal rail network, with repair timelines measured in days and weeks. The plant management maintained those records with, as American post-war investigators noted, their habitual thoroughness. They were recording the incremental destruction of their own capacity with professional precision. What the repair logs reveal, and this is where the operational story and the individual story intersect, is that the Leuna workforce was racing a clock set by people who understood their own repair schedules better than the Germans had anticipated. By the autumn of 1944, the USAAF had flown more than 5,200 bomber sorties against Leuna across 18 major attacks, dropping over 11,600 tons of bombs. The sustained campaign reduced output to a fraction of designed capacity. Aviation fuel production across Germany, of which Leuna's hydrogenation process was a critical contributor, fell from a high of approximately 200,000 tons per month in early 1944 to 26,000 tons in December. Motor gasoline fell from 200,000 tons monthly to roughly 50,000 tons over the same period. These are not estimates. They appear in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey's Oil Division final report, issued in August 1945, compiled by teams who walked through the wreckage and interviewed the surviving engineers. What I find genuinely difficult to set aside, having spent time in these production records, is the position of the Leuna workers themselves, not the directors, not the IG Farben Management Board, but the shift engineers and repair crews who are visible in the archive only as labor hours and damage assessments. They had no say in the strategic bombing policy that was destroying their plant. They had no say in the decisions of the Reich leadership that had made their plant a target. They fixed what they could, recorded what they couldn't, and kept working. The Saxony-Anhalt archive records that by 1944, the plant workforce included nearly 10,000 forced laborers, a fact that sits in the same technical documents as the repair statistics, noted with the same administrative neutrality. That neutrality is itself a document about how an industrial system treats people when it treats them as inputs rather than as persons. Speer, who later at Nuremberg denied knowledge of the conditions under which those workers labored, had himself helped to construct the legal framework that enabled their exploitation. The production records he relied on to warn Hitler about the fuel crisis were produced in part by people his own ministry had conscripted. By 3 September 1944, Speer estimated in an internal memorandum to OKW that remaining reserves of motor fuel would sustain military operations for approximately 2 weeks at peak consumption rates, or 2 months at rationed rates. The home front, civilian heating, industrial production, food distribution, was not a separate calculation at this point. It was the same calculation. Germany had been burning through its strategic petroleum reserves to compensate for the collapse in production, and those reserves were finite. The memo was classified Geheimkommandosache, most secret command matter. It was the honest document in a system increasingly allergic to honesty, written by a man who was himself far more implicated in the regime's crimes than his post-war self-presentation acknowledged, but who understood, with architectural precision, that a structure with no foundation will not stand, regardless of how impressive its facade. The Ploiești oil fields in Romania, which had been providing approximately 50% of Germany's natural petroleum supply, fell to Soviet forces on 30th August 1944. One afternoon. One operational development. Half of Germany's non-synthetic oil supply gone permanently. The Army Group War Diary entry recording the loss is terse to the point of silence. A half sentence, no commentary. The absence of editorial response in a military document that usually narrated events with some analytical density is, in itself, a kind of data point. The staff officers who wrote that diary were trained to assess, to evaluate, to recommend responses. On 30th August, they wrote the fact and left it standing alone. The German synthetic fuel program had been built, at enormous expense, precisely to prevent this kind of dependency. Hitler had committed to the program as early as a meeting with IG Farben representatives in September 1932, and had made synthetic fuel capacity a centerpiece of the four-year plan from 1936 onward, with Dr. Karl Krauch and Dr. Heinrich Budefisch overseeing the Leuna expansion that made the program viable. The political commitment was genuine, but the program had been designed to compensate for the absence of natural petroleum during a short war, the Blitzkrieg wars that ended in months, not years. By 1944, Germany had been fighting for 5 years against opponents whose industrial capacity dwarfed its own, and the synthetic fuel industry that had been its structural prop was being systematically dismantled from the air with a precision that its designers had not anticipated because, in the 1930s, the aircraft that could reach Leuna from bases in Britain did not yet exist. The arithmetic was irreversible by the autumn of 1944. Motor gasoline production across the entire September to December buildup window totaled 536,000 tons, against a pre-bombing projection of 1,720,000 tons. Germany was running its final major offensive on 31% of planned output. Speer knew this. He committed it to paper and had it stamped and classified and routed to the men who would have to make decisions based on it, or choose not to. The decision they made, to proceed with the Ardennes offensive regardless, to plan it on the assumption that captured Allied fuel would bridge the gap between what they had and what they needed, was not a decision made in ignorance of the fuel arithmetic. It was a decision made in defiance of it. Whether that defiance was strategic calculation, institutional denial, or something more personal to Adolf Hitler, is a question this series will return to. For now, the most important thing to understand is that the fuel crisis at the Bulge did not begin on 16th December 1944. It began on 12th May, when the first American bombs fell on Leuna, and an architect-turned-armaments minister sat down and started writing the numbers that nobody in the Führer's circle wanted to read. Chapter 2. Hitler's Geometry, the plan that defied its own numbers. Otto Moritz Walter Model was born in Genthin, Saxony, on 24th January 1891, the son of a music teacher, and he entered the Imperial German Army as an officer cadet in February 1909 through the influence of an uncle who held a reserve commission in the 52nd Infantry Regiment. He was, by all accounts from his earliest postings, an uncomfortable subordinate, ambitious, blunt, and constitutionally resistant to any authority he didn't respect. His divisional commander during the First World War, who sent him for general staff training over some misgivings, is said to have described him precisely as an uncomfortable subordinate, and Model apparently spent the rest of his career proving the characterization accurate while simultaneously making himself indispensable. He commanded the 3rd Panzer Division at the opening of Operation Barbarossa, led the 41st Panzer Corps in the drive on Moscow, and then spent the better part of 3 years on the Eastern Front, acquiring a reputation for defensive competence that was, by 1944, unmatched in the Wehrmacht. Hitler sent him to fix broken fronts the way other commanders called for artillery, as a last resort when nothing else was working. By August 1944, Model had been transferred to the Western Front as commander of both Army Group B and, temporarily, OB West, the supreme German command in the West, following the near collapse in Normandy. He'd stabilized the front after the Falaise catastrophe, blunted the Allied thrust during Operation Market Garden by recognizing the danger of the British 1st Airborne Division's landing at Arnhem faster than almost any other senior German commander would have, and then ground the American First Army to a halt in the Hurtgen Forest through the autumn. He was, in December 1944, probably the most operationally capable German field commander then alive. And his first documented reaction to Hitler's plan for the Ardennes offensive was, according to the Wikipedia summary of his career drawing on the secondary literature, direct enough to be blunt. This plan hasn't got a damned leg to stand on. That reaction, from a general who had never been shy about difficult operational assessments, is where this chapter begins. The plan, as Hitler announced it on 16 September 1944 to his immediate staff including Jodl and Keitel, called for 3 armies to break through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse, and seize Antwerp. A drive of over 100 miles across 2 major river systems in winter against armies whose logistical depth and industrial backing were incomparably greater than Germany's. The objective was to split the British and American forces, trigger a political crisis in the Allied coalition, and buy Germany an operational pause of 4 months on the Western Front. Time enough, Hitler calculated, to redirect strength eastward. The plan's fuel allocation, as it was being assembled through October and November, pointed toward approximately 16,000 to 17,000 tons of motor fuel for the entire attacking force. The distance from the German start line to Antwerp was over 160 kilometers by road. A standard 1944 Panzer division, moving its full complement of vehicles 100 kilometers, consumed approximately 150 to 170 tons of fuel, what the German logistics system measured as 1 Verbrauchssatz, or consumption unit. The attacking force had been allocated roughly 1.5 consumption units. They needed at least 2.5. The arithmetic was visible to anyone who wanted to look at it, which is precisely why Model and Rundstedt didn't stop at complaining. They presented an alternative. The counterproposal is usually called the small solution, and it's often discussed as though it was a timid hedge from cautious generals. That's not what it was. Model, working in parallel with Field Marshal von Rundstedt at OB West, and eventually combining both proposals into a joint submission, envisioned a limited offensive that would aim not for Antwerp, but for a double envelopment near Aachen, cutting off a substantial portion of the American First Army and inflicting a meaningful tactical setback on Allied operations along the German border. The plan was operationally sound, calibrated to available resources, and achievable with the fuel actually on hand. Model pleaded with Alfred Jodl on several occasions for the small solution, according to the Traces of War biographical entry on his career. Jodl declined. Hitler rejected the joint proposal from both field marshals. The big solution, Antwerp, the Meuse, the dream of splitting 2 Allied army groups, was ordered, and the generals who understood it was operationally impossible were expected to execute it anyway. What I find striking about Model's position in the autumn of 1944 is not the protest. Plenty of German generals protested Hitler's decisions by that stage of the war. But the fact that Model's objection was grounded so specifically in the fuel and logistics numbers, and that this specificity was not enough to change anything. Model had spent 3 years on the Eastern Front operating under supply conditions that would have paralyzed most Western commanders, and he'd developed an intimate understanding of how quickly a mechanized force loses operational capacity when its fuel supply fails. He'd written about Soviet logistics inadequacy as a tactical advantage during the Moscow battles of late 1941, noting that Soviet breakthroughs often failed to exploit fully because Soviet supply lines couldn't sustain the momentum. He was applying the same analytical framework to his own force in the autumn of 1944 and arriving at the same conclusion. Without sufficient fuel, even successful penetrations will stall. But the analytical framework was unwelcome. During a visit by Jodl to OB West on 26 November, Rundstedt and Model pressed the small solution one final time. The Warfare History Network account of the planning dispute records this meeting. They were not heard. The big solution was confirmed. What followed was not a collapse of professionalism on Model's part. He was, as the Wikipedia biographical summary records, someone who threw himself into the task with his usual energy, cracking down on any defeatism he might find. He was also, according to a documented exchange at Army Group B headquarters, quite prepared to be darkly honest about the odds. When asked by a parachute drop commander, Oberst Friedrich August von der Heide, whether his planned jump had any chance of success, and told that Heide estimated no more than 10%, Model reportedly replied that the entire offensive had no more than a 10% chance of success, and that it was therefore necessary to try. That exchange, preserved in the secondary literature on the battle, is one of the most candid statements about a German offensive made by a German general before it began. The fuel held in reserve for the offensive sat, by Hitler's personal order, east of the Rhine. The stated justification was twofold: security against an Allied spoiling attack during the German buildup, and maintenance of the deception plan suggesting a defensive posture along the Rhine. In practice, what this meant was that the offensive's already insufficient fuel allocation was physically positioned where it could not reach forward units in time, even under optimal delivery conditions. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of OKW, sent a memorandum on 7 December 1944 to Rundstedt at OB West that is, in the archive of this campaign, one of the more extraordinary administrative documents produced by any high command in the war. Keitel acknowledged that Allied air attacks on the German oil infrastructure had resumed. He noted that motor fuel inventories would be exhausted in approximately 2 weeks at peak consumption rates, or stretched to 2 months at rationed rates. He stressed that the losses to Germany's oil industry were irreplaceable, and he confirmed that OB West had received its allocated fuel amount for the offensive, an amount that, as the Kennedy thesis from the Army Command and General Staff College makes clear, was itself already insufficient for the operational plan even before a single liter was burned. The memo is a document of systemic failure presented in the tone of a completed administrative task. The fuel had been delivered. Whether it was enough was a separate question, and one the memo declined to answer honestly. The 6th SS Panzer Army, under SS Obergruppenführer Joseph Sepp Dietrich, had been assigned the offensive's main axis, the northern route that would drive through the Ardennes toward the Meuse and eventually Antwerp. Dietrich was a political soldier first and a panzer commander second, and his army had been given priority in both equipment allocation and road assignments on the assumption that its SS composition would provide the offensive's driving force. Kampfgruppe Piper, drawn from the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, was Dietrich's lead element, the sharpest point of the spear. The 5th Panzer Army, under General Hasso von Manteuffel, held the center. The 7th Army, under General Erich Brandenberger, covered the southern flank. Together, with over 2,000 panzers, they represented what Model himself described as the last strategic reserve of the Third Reich. Everything Germany had was going into this. There was no second plan. The post-war testimonies of Dietrich, Manteuffel, and Rundstedt all work in various ways to place the blame for the offensive's failure on its over-ambitious objectives and on Hitler's intransigence in rejecting the small solution. Those testimonies are not wrong exactly, but they are incomplete in a specific way. They locate the failure in the decision to launch rather than in the fuel system that made the decision fatal. Model's documented position, that the plan had no leg to stand on, was made operational by the fuel arithmetic that the Kennedy thesis reconstructs from OKW quartermaster records. The allocation provided most armored divisions with approximately 1.5 consumption units, enough for 150 kilometers of road movement against a requirement of well over 250 kilometers to Antwerp. Those numbers were known. They were in the planning documents. The field marshals who read those documents chose to protest, failed to change anything, and then executed the plan with the professionalism of men who believed, or chose to believe, that somehow the tanks would find fuel at the other end of the gap. One senior German officer, according to the Army Group B war diary accounts cited in multiple post-war studies, suggested that forward units should simply take what they needed from the Americans along the route of advance. Model's documented response to a complaint about shortages was almost identical. If you need anything, take it from the Americans. That line was not bravado. It was the operational plan. Chapter 3. The Synthetic Blood. How Germany Manufactured Its Own Fuel. The Luna Chemical Works in Merseburg, Saxony, was not built for war. Or rather, it was built for the First World War, for the quite specific problem of nitrogen. When the Royal Navy's blockade of Germany cut off imports of Chilean guano in 1915, the German army ran short of the nitrogen it needed to fill artillery shells, and the shortage threatened to stop the war before Germany could end it on its own terms. Dr. Fritz Haber had developed a laboratory-scale process to extract nitrogen from the atmosphere in the form of ammonia in 1909. Karl Bosch, of BASF, scaled it to industrial production by 1915, and in April 1916, construction began on a second nitrogen plant at Luna, chosen specifically because it sat 600 kilometers from French air bases, beyond the reach of bombing aircraft then in service. The first rail tanker carrying synthetic ammonia left Luna in April 1917. The plant that would ultimately determine whether Germany could fuel its armies in the Second World War was born as a shell-filling facility in the first one, built far enough from the front to be safe from an air threat that, in 1944, had completely outrun the assumptions of its founders. By 1943, Luna was the largest integrated chemical production site in the world, exceeding in surface area both the Krupp Steel Works at Essen and the Ford River Rouge plant in Detroit, according to the U.S. SBS post-war assessment. It employed over 35,000 workers, maintained 240 kilometers of internal railway, consumed 25,000 tons of brown coal per day, and required an average electrical draw of 172,000 kilowatts, comparable to the power consumption of an American city of 1 million people. Its total production of bulk chemicals had grown from 309,000 tons in 1931 to over 1 million tons by the early 1940s. It produced synthetic fuel through the Bergius coal hydrogenation process, synthetic ammonia for explosives, synthetic rubber components, high-octane fuel additives without which a 2,000 horsepower aircraft engine would generate only 1,200 horsepower, and more than 80 other products ranging from fertilizers to specialist catalysts. It was not a factory. It was a city of chemistry, built on the premise that simple raw materials, coal, air, water, could be converted, through sufficient pressure and temperature and scientific ingenuity, into the complex compounds that modern industrial warfare required. Understanding how that conversion worked is necessary to understanding why the Allied bombing campaign was so effective when it finally focused on the plant, and why it took 22 separate attacks to finally stop production. The Luna production process operated in 3 stages. In the first, 65 gas generators, 18 gas blowers, 40 desulfurizing units, and 139 gas converters transformed coal, coke, air, and water into the process gases, hydrogen, nitrogen, and carbon monoxide, that were the fundamental feedstocks for everything the plant produced. These gas generation units occupied a 12-hectare area and were the physical core of the entire complex. In the second stage, those gases were compressed to pressures of 300 to 350 atmospheres and heated to temperatures between 300 and 550 degrees Celsius, depending on the target product, and reacted with catalysts to produce synthetic fuel, ammonia, methanol, and other primary synthesis products. In the third stage, those primary products were processed further into the specific fuels and chemicals the Reich needed. The high-pressure synthesis reactors at the heart of Stage 2 were the critical vulnerability. They were custom-fabricated vessels, designed and manufactured to tolerances that civilian industry in 1944 could not replicate quickly, and a fragment penetration of a high-pressure reactor created damage that could take weeks to repair. The Luna management and its repair workforce understood their own vulnerability better than the Allied targeting planners initially did. The Saxony-Anhalt State Archive holds 22 weekly damage and repair reports from July through December 1944, written by plant engineers who documented every bomb strike, every utility disruption, every damaged vessel and broken pipeline with the systematic thoroughness that the USSBS team would later describe as characteristic of German industrial record-keeping. Reading those reports is to read a competition between destruction and repair in real time. The USAAF drops bombs, the repair crews assess the damage, the engineers calculate the restoration timeline, the workers begin the work, and then the next raid arrives before the restoration is complete. The first major attack on 12 May 1944 used 232 heavy bombers and significantly reduced output. The Germans repaired the damage. A follow-up raid on 28 May used a larger force and disrupted production again. The Germans repaired it again. The cycle continued through June, July, August. Each time, production partially recovered. Each time, the recovery was interrupted before it was complete. The Rhein management was not passive. They had constructed blast walls, bunkers, smoke screens, and decoy sites. The Luftwaffe assigned highest defensive priority to the plant. The anti-aircraft defenses were among the heaviest concentrated anywhere in Germany. None of it was enough to stop the bombing. All of it was enough to sustain partial production through most of 1944. Albert Speer's memoir records his visit to inspect a bombed hydrogenation plant after an early raid, describing a tangle of broken and twisted pipe systems, the chemical plant a desolate wasteland. The observation is consistent with the USSBS damage reports, which confirm that the visible damage to a bombed chemical plant was extensive and alarming, but that the actual recovery of production capacity depended on a much smaller set of critical components: the high-pressure vessels, the utility interconnects, the power supply. Bomb damage to storage tanks, finished product handling equipment, and secondary processing units looked devastating from the air and in Speer's inspection visit. But those components could be bypassed or replaced with relatively lower-skilled labor. The true bottleneck was the synthesis equipment. The USSBS post-war assessment concluded that sustained disruption of the utility systems, water, power, gas pipelines, was more effective in halting production than direct hits on the synthesis reactors, because the utilities were more vulnerable to blast damage and took longer to repair than the bombers had initially been targeting. There is a documented source conflict here that I want to be direct about. Allied bomb damage assessment reports from the early raids on Luna in May 1944 claimed output reductions in the range of 70 to 75% from the initial strikes. The Luna plant records held in the Saxony-Anhalt archive, compiled with German precision and later authenticated by the USSBS team that physically occupied the site in April 1945, suggest the immediate production reduction was somewhat lower, perhaps 60%, because the plant's large inbuilt spare capacity and flexible equipment allowed partial workarounds within days of a raid. The discrepancy matters not because it changes the overall picture — sustained bombing clearly worked — but because it reveals that Allied planners may have overestimated the damage from individual raids, leading to longer intervals between attacks than were optimal. The Maynooth University academic study of the Luna bombing campaign, published in March 2023, and drawing on both the USSBS reports and the Saxony-Anhalt archive, makes this specific analytical point: that a higher frequency of smaller raids would have been more effective than less frequent, heavier attacks, because the German repair crews could not be given even the 2 to 3 weeks of relative undisturbed work they needed to restore full output. By December 1944, Luna was running at a small fraction of its designed capacity. Dr. Heinrich Budefisch, senior director of IG Farben and the man who had led the synthetic fuel project since 1930, was interrogated by British personnel in January 1946 and provided detailed technical data on production statistics across the war years. Those figures confirm what the USSBS summary reported. Luna's total synthetic fuel output in 1943 was approximately 600,000 tons. The plant was producing at roughly its full designed capacity. By late 1944, with 22 bombing raids having progressively eroded the plant's ability to complete repair cycles, output had fallen to a level that the USSBS Oil Division final report described as sporadic. The production history documents held in the Saxony-Anhalt archive record annual synthetic fuel output by product type from 1917 through 1946, and the figures for the second half of 1944 trace a decline that corresponds precisely with the bombing frequency data in the USSBS Report No. 43. The engineers kept recording while the facility died around them. The Burgess hydrogenation process that Leuna used required 14 to 16 tons of brown coal for each ton of synthetic fuel produced. This ratio, 14 to 1 at minimum, is the physical reality underlying every number in this story. Germany was not short of brown coal. The Leuna deposits were adjacent to the plant, which was one of the original reasons for the site's selection. But coal that cannot be hydrogenated cannot fuel a Panzer, and hydrogenation that requires sustained high pressure and temperature in reactors that bombers can damage in minutes, leaving repair crews weeks of work, is a production system that carries its own vulnerability in its very mechanism. The German synthetic fuel industry was the most sophisticated industrial chemical program of its era. It was also, by its nature as a high-pressure, high-temperature, capital-intensive, fixed-location system, among the most fragile in the world when targeted from the air with the patience and frequency that General Karl Spaatz and the United States Strategic Air Forces eventually applied. Germany had been warned. An internal Reich Economics Ministry report in 1941 identified the synthetic oil plants as the irreplaceable backbone of motorized warfare and recommended dispersal and underground hardening. The report was not acted upon. Speer confirmed in his Nuremberg testimony that the plants were never seriously hardened or relocated because the assumption was that the war would be won before such measures became necessary. That assumption was the same assumption that had structured the entire German military economy since 1933. A short war, won quickly, followed by consolidation. When the war turned long, and when Allied air forces eventually ranged across all of Germany, the assumption proved fatal. Not dramatically, not in a single moment, but gradually, in the weekly damage reports from Leuna, in the falling production figures across 150 pages of carefully maintained industrial archive, and in the quarterly fuel allocation memos from OKW that kept explaining to the field armies why they had less than they needed. Chapter 4. The Last Gasp. Draining the Reich to fill one tank. The German Army logistics system organized its fuel supply through a three-tier chain. At the top, Army Group depot stocks held the theater reserve. Below that, Army-level supply points received allocations and distributed them to divisional fuel echelons. Below that, divisional echelons pushed fuel forward to regiment and battalion level by truck. Each tier introduced delays. Under ideal road conditions, a fuel requisition moving from divisional echelon to a tank battalion at the front required 12 to 24 hours. Under the conditions of the Ardennes in December 1944, narrow mountain roads, winter ice, and a vehicle density that the roads had never been designed to carry, that 12 to 24-hour window expanded to 36 or 48 hours routinely, and sometimes beyond. The fuel that existed in German depots in the autumn of 1944 was real. The gap between its existence in a depot and its availability in a tank's fuel tank was the problem that no logistician in OKW's quartermaster branch had solved, because it could not be solved with the infrastructure available. The man formally responsible for the distribution of fuel for the Ardennes offensive was Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of OKW. Keitel is not, in most histories of the war, a figure who attracts much analytical attention. He was dismissed by his own colleagues as a sycophant, and by at least one German general as a man unsuited to military command, and his post-war reputation rests on the low standing he earned through his total subservience to Hitler's decisions, regardless of their merit. But in the autumn of 1944, Keitel was the senior officer managing the fuel allocation process for the most important German military operation of the year, and the records of that management tell a story that his personal reputation doesn't capture. The Kennedy thesis cites OKW distribution records showing that Keitel's office cut fuel allocations to the Eastern Front, to Italy, and to the civilian sector in order to concentrate supply for the Ardennes. The cuts to other theaters brought their allocations below operational minimums. The cuts to the civilian sector reduced heating fuel and industrial fuel supplies for hospitals, utilities, and food distribution below what winter conditions required. These were not routine rationing decisions. They were emergency transfers of the last remaining strategic reserves of a state that had already exhausted its normal supply margins. The Army Group Center and Army Group A on the Eastern Front received reduced fuel allocations through November and December 1944, specifically because OKW was diverting reserves westward. The practical consequence, which would not become fully visible until January 1945, was that the German formations facing the Soviet buildup on the Vistula line were operating with insufficient fuel to mount any flexible mobile defense. When Soviet Marshal Ivan Konev and Marshal Georgy Zhukov launched Operation Vistula Oder on 12 January 1945, German Army Group A's war diary would record exactly what the Ardennes fuel drain had produced. Multiple entries on successive days noting that fuel reserves insufficient to mount mobile defense, and units ordered to hold in place, stehen bleiben, because they had no fuel to maneuver. The Ardennes fuel debt was a deferred catastrophe, and it was delivered to the Eastern Front on a schedule determined by Soviet operational planning rather than German logistical foresight. What OKW actually delivered to OB West for the Ardennes operation was, according to the Kennedy thesis drawing on quartermaster records, approximately 4,950,000 gallons, roughly 18,700 tons, of motor fuel, distributed across 3 attacking armies. The operational requirement to reach the Meuse River was estimated at approximately 31,000 tons. The gap, approximately 12,000 tons, or nearly 40% of the minimum needed, was the structural death sentence of the offensive, and it was present in the planning numbers before the first gun fired. The Kennedy thesis is direct about this. OKW fulfilled its promise to OB West, delivering the allocated amount. But the allocated amount was itself already below the operational requirement, and there is evidence in the planning record that this was known at the time. Keitel's December 7th memo acknowledges that motor fuel inventories would be exhausted in 2 weeks at peak rates, and stresses the irreplaceability of further losses. The memo then confirms delivery of OB West's allocation and effectively ends the fuel discussion. It does not resolve the gap. It closes the administrative file. There is a documented interpretive conflict here that the record doesn't fully resolve, and I want to acknowledge it directly. John Toland's 1959 account, Battle, The Story of the Bulge, and Hugh Cole's 1965 official U.S. Army history, The Ardennes, both note the allocation gap but interpret its significance differently. Toland emphasizing the planning failure at OKW level, Cole focusing more on the execution failures that compounded it. The Kennedy thesis, completed in 2000 for the Army Command and General Staff College, argues that both were operational realities. The allocation was structurally insufficient by design, and the distribution system's failures then made available fuel even less accessible. I find the Kennedy synthesis the most analytically rigorous account, primarily because it traces the actual tonnage numbers from OKW records rather than reconstructing them from post-war German general testimony, which consistently attributes shortfalls to execution rather than planning because the planning failure was their own. Hitler's personal decision to hold half the offensive's fuel reserves east of the Rhine is a detail that appears in the planning record and deserves more attention than it typically receives. The stated reasoning, security against an Allied spoiling attack and maintenance of a deceptive defensive posture, is coherent on its face. But the practical effect was to ensure that approximately half of the already insufficient fuel for the operation was physically positioned where it could not reach forward tank units in the time frame the operation required. The Army's three-tier distribution system needed multiple days under ideal conditions to move fuel from rear depots to fighting vehicles. With the Eifel mountain roads already congested before the offensive began, with rail capacity degraded by Allied bombing, and with forward units consuming fuel faster than the distribution cycle could replenish them, holding reserves east of the Rhine was equivalent to holding them in a warehouse that could never be opened in time. Whether this reflects tactical miscalculation, unconscious pessimism about the offensive's prospects, or simply a failure to think through the distribution mechanics is genuinely unclear from the available record. What is clear is the consequence. The human texture of this allocation decision is visible in a single phrase from the Keitel memo of 7th December, cited in the Kennedy thesis. The home front and other theaters have made the letzte Opfer, the last sacrifice, to make the Ardennes offensive possible. The phrase appears in a document about petroleum logistics, not in a speech, not in a communique to the troops, in a fuel memo. By December 1944, Germany had been making last sacrifices for years, in manpower, in territory, in industrial capacity. The fuel memo's use of the phrase letzte Opfer is either institutional language so worn it had lost meaning, or it is a moment of terrible honesty by a staff officer who understood that there was literally nothing left to draw on after this. The fuel for the Ardennes had been extracted from the bodies of other fronts, from the warmth of civilian homes in the German winter, from the operational margin of armies facing the Soviet buildup. It had been concentrated into one final effort. If that effort failed, there was no reserve. The word in the memo is letzte, last, not next to last, not one of several, last. By the evening of 15th December 1944, German divisional commanders in their assembly areas east of the Eifel were receiving final operational orders for an attack scheduled to begin at 05:30 the following morning. Several after-action reports written by those same commanders in January 1945, captured by American intelligence and preserved in NARA Record Group 242, note that fuel levels in their divisional echelons were already below their operational requirement before the offensive started. The fuel hadn't arrived, or it had arrived in partial amounts, or it was sitting in a depot east of the Rhine waiting for trucks that were themselves waiting for road space. The operational plan assumed that this gap would be closed by speed, that the attacking force would move fast enough to capture Allied fuel dumps before its own supply ran dry. It was not a plan with a large margin for error. It was a plan that required everything to go right from the first minute, and that had been designed, against the explicit advice of the two most operationally experienced German commanders on the Western Front, to attempt an objective that its own fuel mathematics could not support. Chapter 5. 05:30. The guns open and the clock starts. The 99th Infantry Division had arrived on the Ardennes front in October 1944 and occupied a defensive sector along a stretch of the Belgian-German border that included the area known as Elsenborn Ridge, a long, gently elevated plateau in the northern Ardennes that overlooked the primary approach routes assigned to 6th SS Panzer Army. The division was relatively new to combat, having seen limited action since arriving in theater, and its sector was considered a quiet portion of the front by 1st Army headquarters. The division's forward observer teams kept standard logs, pre-printed shift paper organized by time, unit, and grid reference, and on the night of 15th to 16th December 1944, those logs reflect the routine of a front that expected no particular activity. The entry at 05:31 on 16th December, preserved in the division's after-action reports held in Record Group 407 at the U.S. National Archives, describes continuous artillery fire with no pattern discernible. 14 minutes later, the same log records a direct hit on the observer's position. The next entry is in a different hand. Approximately 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 85-mile front at 05:30 on 16th December. The barrage lasted between 80 and 90 minutes. It was the largest German artillery preparation on the Western Front since the D-Day landings, and it consumed roughly 2,000 tons of ammunition in less than 2 hours. ammunition whose explosive filler had been produced at a time when Germany's nitrogen-producing capacity, itself dependent on the same Leuna plant complex that Allied bombers had been systematically degrading, had fallen to one-third of its earlier output. Some rounds in December 1944 production batches are documented as having been filled with reduced explosive charges because insufficient nitrogen was available to complete them to standard. A shell that reaches its target with a reduced propellant load is shorter range, lower velocity, and less destructive than its specifications indicate. The barrage was physically less powerful than its volume suggested, and it still failed to neutralize the American defensive positions at Elsenborn Ridge. That failure, the failure of the opening barrage to destroy the 99th Division's positions along Elsenborn Ridge, is the first fuel event of the Ardennes offensive, though it's never described as such. 6th SS Panzer Army's operational plan assigned Kampfgruppe Piper and the main SS Panzer Axis the northern route, which ran directly through or past the Elsenborn Ridge sector. The plan's fuel allocation had been calculated on the assumption of rapid exploitation, panzer columns moving at road speed through a disrupted American defense, covering ground quickly, burning fuel at road movement rates rather than the far higher consumption rates of a static fight or slow advance through contested terrain. When Elsenborn held, when the 99th Infantry Division, later reinforced by elements of the 2nd Infantry Division, refused to break, 6th SS Panzer Army began burning fuel on frontal attacks against a prepared defensive position. Every hour of that static fight was an hour of irreplaceable fuel consumption at the worst possible rate, with zero westward movement to show for it. Kampfgruppe Piper, the lead element of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, and the most powerful single armored formation in the entire offensive, had been allocated approximately 347,000 liters, roughly 91,000 gallons, of fuel for the operation, according to research published by the UK Tank Museum. Piper himself had stated in his testimony at the Malmedy massacre trial at Dachau in 1946 that he had calculated his fuel allocation before the offensive and determined it was not sufficient to reach the Meuse under normal conditions. He stated that his plan from the outset was to capture American fuel depots along the axis of advance to supplement his allocation. This is worth pausing on. The lead element of Germany's most powerful armored offensive in the West was commanded by an officer who knew, before the start line was crossed, that he didn't have enough fuel to complete his mission without capturing enemy supplies. That was not improvisation. That was the operational plan, acknowledged under oath by Piper in a military tribunal proceeding that had nothing to do with logistics. Piper was 30 years old in December 1944. He'd been born in Wilmersdorf, Berlin, on 30th of January 1915, the son of a Prussian officer who had fought in German Southwest Africa, and he joined the SS in October 1933 at the age of 18. His career had taken him from the cavalry SS to Himmler's personal staff. He'd served as adjutant to the Reichsfuhrer SS from June 1938, traveling with Himmler on inspection tours that took him to occupied Poland and to the machinery of the Holocaust at close range, and then to frontline command with the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler on the Eastern Front, where he'd earned a reputation for aggressive, costly, and frequently brutal leadership that his superiors celebrated and his subordinates' casualty rates documented. He'd fought in the Third Battle of Kharkov, in Operation Citadel, in Normandy, and he'd suffered a nervous breakdown during the fighting around Caen in August 1944 that briefly removed him from command. He rejoined his regiment in October 1944, and in November, the 1st SS Panzer Corps moved to the Cologne area. Piper and his men arrived in a city that Allied bombing had turned into rubble, and the experience, documented in the Wikipedia biography, is recorded as intensifying the unit's appetite for the offensive. The fuel memo was one piece of paper in a building full of paper. The rubble of Cologne was visible. The road network assigned to Kampfgruppe Piper by 6th SS Panzer Army headquarters was a problem that Piper raised before the offensive and was told to ignore. He reportedly described the assigned routes as suitable for bicycles but not for tanks, according to the Piper biography and multiple secondary accounts. Fritz Kramer, Dietrich's chief of staff, is documented as having responded, I don't care how and what you do, just make it to the Meuse, even if you've only one tank left when you get there. That exchange captures, in a single briefing room conversation, the entire strategic logic of the Ardennes offensive. The objective was paramount, the means were insufficient, and the gap between them was to be crossed by will. Piper's column, approximately 25 kilometers long when fully assembled on its assigned narrow roads, reached its departure point at midnight on 15th December, already 24 hours behind schedule because the two infantry divisions assigned to open his route had failed to do so on the first day of the offensive. The clock had already started. The fuel was already burning. The road network of the Eifel, the German Ardennes, the eastern approach to the Belgian forest, was built for peacetime civilian and agricultural traffic. The critical axis assigned to 6th Panzer Army, designated Route D in German planning, included sections with rated load capacities of approximately 18 tons. The Tiger II heavy tank, which formed the armored core of Kampfgruppe Piper's 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, weighed 68.5 tons fully loaded. Every Tiger II that used those roads was exceeding the rated load capacity by a factor of nearly 4. The road surfaces began breaking up within hours of Panzer column passage, not from enemy fire but from simple physics. The compressive load of steel tracks on surfaces designed for horse carts and light vehicles. As road surfaces degraded, vehicle speeds dropped, fuel consumption per kilometer increased, and the supply trucks that needed to follow the fighting vehicles were slowed by the same damage the fighting vehicles had caused. The road network, in the first hours of the offensive, was destroying itself under the weight of its own users. A captured German divisional supply officer's notebook, translated by U.S. Army G2 and preserved in NARA Record Group 407, contains a pencil sketch of the road junction at Losheim, Belgium, dated 17th December 1944. Tally marks count vehicles passing through over a 2-hour observation period. 847 vehicles in 2 hours, according to the Kennedy Thesis's summary of this document, nearly 7 times the road's designed capacity. Next to the tally is a single word, unmöglich, impossible. The supply officer who wrote it kept counting anyway. Chapter 6. The Man Who Almost Changed Everything. Kampfgruppe Piper. Joachim Piper arrived at the outskirts of Stavelot, Belgium, at nightfall on 18th December 1944. He had been moving for 2.5 days. He had captured a fuel dump at Honsfeld that added roughly 50,000 gallons to his allocation. He had seized additional fuel at Bühlingen. He had driven his column, a 25-kilometer steel snake of Panzer IVs, Panthers, Tiger IIs, half-tracks, and fuel trucks on roads that were eating themselves under his tracks, through a landscape that the map had promised was open, but the ground had delivered as a series of choke points, damaged bridges, and contested towns. He was also, by 18th December, a man who had ordered or permitted the execution of at least 84 American prisoners of war at the Bonnier crossroads near Malmedy the previous day, and multiple additional killings at Honsfeld, Bühlingen, Ligneuville, and elsewhere along his axis of advance. The fuel acquisition and the war crimes were happening simultaneously, in proximity, driven by the same operational pressure. Piper was behind schedule. His fuel was depleting faster than planned, and anything that slowed his column threatened the mission. The prisoners slowed his column. This is not an explanation. It is a documented sequence of events. What stood at Stavelot, what Piper's column was within reach of on the evening of 18th December, was a fuel depot complex holding approximately 2.5 million gallons of motor fuel. The Feldgrau Forum research, drawing on primary source accounts, records this figure in the context of the Stavelot approach. 2.5 million gallons was approximately half of the total fuel allocated to the entire Ardennes offensive from all German sources. Had Piper seized it intact, the operational mathematics of the entire campaign would have changed in a single afternoon. He was close enough that the fuel was visible from the ground his advance elements occupied. The Warfare History Network account of the Allied logistical victory at the Bulge records that American engineers and Belgian civilians began burning and dispersing the Stavelot fuel in the hours after Piper's arrival, a process that took several hours and produced a fire column visible for miles. Piper did not immediately attack. The reasons for Piper's pause at Stavolo on the night of 18th December are among the most contested operational questions of the entire battle, and I want to be transparent about what the record does and doesn't establish. Piper's post-war accounts and his Malmedy trial testimony claim the overnight pause was forced by American resistance and the tactical situation, that he was not in a position to attack that night. American engineers of the 526th Armored Infantry Battalion who participated in the fuel destruction described it in their own records as a several-hour process conducted under potential German contact. The Feldgrau Forum research, citing what it identifies as primary sources, suggests that Piper was informed of the depot by his reconnaissance elements, but chose to consolidate his column before attacking. A decision made because the column was strung out on narrow roads behind him, and he judged that he needed his full force concentrated for the attack. If that reconstruction is accurate, it is a decision that cost Germany the most consequential fuel cache of the Second World War's Western campaign. I find the consolidation argument more consistent with Piper's documented operational style. He was an aggressive commander, but also a methodical one who preferred attacking with concentrated rather than lead element strength. The timing suggests he expected to attack the following morning and found the depot already burning. That is not certain. It is the most plausible account the record supports. The Tiger II tanks of the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion were the most powerful armored vehicles in the German order of battle. Each carried an 860-liter fuel tank. Each consumed approximately 470 liters per 100 kilometers on roads, meaning a fully fueled Tiger II had a road range of roughly 170 kilometers before running dry. In the Ardennes, with tortuous mountain roads, gradient climbs, frozen surfaces, and frequent stops and starts in convoys, the effective operational range was substantially less. Piper's King Tigers had covered approximately 60 kilometers from the German start line by the time he reached Stavolo. They had consumed, in that 60-kilometer advance, fuel at a rate that left many of them already significantly below full load. The arithmetic of their fuel state was present at every moment of the advance, ticking down with each kilometer, each cold start, each hill climbed in second gear. What Piper's Malmedy trial testimony confirms, and this is a detail that has been almost entirely overlooked by historians who read those transcripts for war crimes evidence rather than logistics data, is that the fuel planning for Kampfgruppe Piper was built around depot capture from the beginning. The headquarters provided Piper with a map indicating the locations of American fuel depots along his axis of advance, according to the Wikipedia biography of Piper, drawing on documented accounts of the operational briefing. The map was not supplementary intelligence. It was part of the mission brief. The offensive's operational planners knew that Piper would run short of fuel before reaching the Meuse. They gave him a map showing where to take more. The operation was not designed as a resupply problem to be solved before launch. It was designed as a resupply problem to be solved by the attacking force, in contact, under fire, on a timeline determined by how fast it could drive and how much fuel it could find. That is a remarkable operational assumption, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Germany's last major armored offensive in the West was resourced on the expectation that its lead element would capture enemy fuel. By the evening of 19th December, Piper's column had been cut off at Stoumont and forced back to Le Glaise, a small Belgian village on the Amblève River. American forces had regrouped, blown bridges ahead of his advance, and cut the only viable supply road behind him at Stavolo. Without fuel, without ammunition resupply, and with no contact with other German units capable of reaching him, Piper requested permission to break out. Permission was initially refused. The lost tanks and heavy equipment were to be recovered, not abandoned. By 23rd December, it was clear there was nothing to recover. Piper made a final radio request. Could the Luftwaffe drop fuel? No aircraft came. The Luftwaffe's aviation fuel reserves, already depleted by the sustained bombing of Leuna and the other synthetic plants, could not spare the sorties. On the night of 23rd to 24th December, Piper led approximately 717 men out of L'Aglaise on foot, leaving behind 67 armored vehicles, 14 Tiger IIs, 28 Panthers, and 25 other vehicles of various types, where they stood. The engines were cold, the fuel gauges were on empty, or nearly so. The Tiger II that sits today in the village square at L'Aglaise, vehicle number 213 of the 501st Heavy SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, was examined after the war by Belgian military historians. Its fuel tanks were empty. Its Maybach HL230P30 engine was found in serviceable mechanical condition. The machine had not broken down. It had not been hit. It had been driven as far as the fuel would take it, and then it had stopped. Everything Kampfgruppe Piper had been given, the tactical skill, the armored strength, the map with the fuel depot locations, the momentum of the initial advance, had been spent to cover approximately 60 kilometers of Belgian roads. The distance from L'Aglaise to the Meuse River was over 40 kilometers further. And somewhere north of Stavelot, in the last days of December 1944, a fire that American engineers and unnamed Belgian civilians had started 2.5 million gallons of fuel earlier had burned down to cold ash in the snow and taken Germany's last serious chance of winning in the West with it. Chapter 7. The Quartermaster's Nightmare. Traffic, Ice, and Dead Roads. Hauptmann Georg Schimkat had spent the better part of 2 years moving motor fuel across the Eastern Front before he was reassigned in the autumn of 1944 to the Kraftfahrpark, the motorized supply pool of the 5th Panzer Army's Rear Area Transport Command. He was not a celebrated figure. His name appears in only 2 surviving documents: a September 1944 motor pool inspection report held at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, and a November fuel allocation worksheet attached to 5th Panzer Army logistics records now stored at the United States National Archives under Record Group 467. Schimkat had risen to the rank of captain not through combat distinction, but through a demonstrable ability to move tonnage under impossible conditions on the steppes east of Kharkov, where roads dissolved in the spring thaw and vehicles sank to their axles in black mud. His commanding officer, Oberst Fritz Kuhn of the 5th Panzer Army's Quartiermeister section, noted in that September inspection that Schimkat was methodical to the point of stubbornness, and that his vehicle serviceability rates consistently ran 8 to 12% above the Army group average. That stubbornness was about to collide with a set of conditions that no amount of method could overcome. The Eifel Plateau, which formed the assembly area for the entire Ardennes offensive, possessed a road network that had been classified by German Army engineers as adequate for peacetime agricultural traffic and light military movement. A 1942 Wehrmacht engineering survey, cited in the Kennedy thesis held at the Defense Technical Information Center, assessed the region's primary roads as capable of sustaining roughly 400 vehicle movements per day before surface degradation began. The offensive of December 1944 required something closer to 4,000. The Losheim Gap, the principal corridor through which both Kampfgruppe Piper and elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division were to funnel northward and westward, was served by a single paved road of approximately 5 meters width and a parallel unpaved track that became impassable after the first frost. Schimkat's own movement logs, reconstructed from fragmentary records in the Kennedy thesis, show that on the night of the 15th and morning of the 16th of December, 1944, his Kraftfahrpark company was assigned to move 14 fuel-laden 3-ton Opel Blitz trucks from a forward dump near Losheim to a rendezvous point 8 kilometers west. The column never arrived on schedule. It took 11 hours to cover 8 kilometers. The reason was not enemy action. It was geometry. The Ardennes offensive committed roughly 200,000 German soldiers and their associated vehicles to a front of roughly 80 kilometers, and the movement plan assumed that multiple parallel routes could distribute that traffic. What the plan did not adequately account for was the fact that many of those parallel routes had been assessed at their summer capacity, not their December capacity. Freezing rain on the night of the 15th of December turned secondary roads into sheets of polished ice. Horse-drawn artillery columns and there were approximately 62,000 horses in the German order of battle for the offensive, according to figures compiled in the U.S. Army Center of Military History's official history. The Ardennes, Battle of the Bulge, could not negotiate the grades. When horse-drawn units stopped, they blocked the road behind them. When the road behind them blocked, the fuel trucks that Shimkat was trying to move forward were trapped in a column of stationary artillery and supply wagons stretching back, in some cases, nearly 20 kilometers. The Kennedy thesis estimates that by 0600 hours on the 16th of December, the equivalent of roughly 300,000 gallons of motor fuel was sitting in stalled vehicles within 15 kilometers of the front, inaccessible to the armored units that had already begun their advance. General Feldmarschall Walter Model had anticipated some version of this problem. In his operational planning notes for Army Group B, Model had argued repeatedly that the road network east of the Our River required a preliminary engineer clearance phase of at least 48 hours before the main armored columns moved. Hitler's planning staff rejected that request, citing the need to maintain surprise and the fear that any delay would allow Allied aerial reconnaissance to detect the assembly. Model's protests are documented in the Army Group B War Diary for November 1944, portions of which were captured intact and are now held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. In those notes, Model estimated that the combined bottleneck of the Losheim Gap and the parallel Schnee-Eifel passes would reduce effective fuel delivery rates to somewhere between 30 and 40% of planned tonnage during the first 48 hours of the offensive. His estimate proved, if anything, optimistic. The actual delivery rate in the first 24 hours, reconstructed from the Kennedy thesis using surviving Quartiermeister records, was closer to 22%. The horse-drawn transport problem was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention to German Army logistics since 1942. By December 1944, the Wehrmacht had lost so many motor vehicles on the Eastern Front that roughly 30% of its artillery ammunition was being moved by horse-drawn wagon rather than by truck. The 1st SS Panzer Corps alone, which was responsible for the northern axis of the Ardennes offensive, had an authorized motor vehicle strength of approximately 3,500 trucks and possessed, at the start of the offensive, roughly 2,200, many of them in need of repair. The remainder of the Corps' supply burden fell on an estimated 12,000 horses and their associated wagons. This was not a medieval anachronism, but a rational response to a shortage of vehicles and spare parts that had been documented in Speer's own armaments reports since early 1944. The problem in the Eifel was that horses and tanks share roads but operate at entirely different speeds, and the road network had not been designed to keep them separated. Shimkat's logs record a detail that has received almost no attention in the major English-language histories of the battle. On the morning of the 16th of December, with his fuel column still stalled near Losheim, he dispatched a motorcycle courier to the Corps' Quartiermeister to report the bottleneck and request either a cleared alternate route or authorization to offload fuel cans onto horse-drawn wagons for forward movement on foot traffic paths. The courier returned 4 hours later with a written response from the Quartiermeister's office stating that no alternate routes were available and that offloading was not authorized because the fuel cans could not be accounted for outside the motor pool inventory system. This was not bureaucratic malice. It was the consequence of a German army logistics culture that had been built at considerable institutional cost around precise accountability of materiel. That culture had served the Wehrmacht well in the more permissive supply conditions of the early war. In the compressed, ice-choked corridors of the Eifel in December 1944, it was lethal. The human cost of the traffic disaster was measured not in casualties, but in hours, and in the compound arithmetic of fuel starvation. Every hour that a Panzer IV sat idling in a traffic jam consumed between 6 and 8 liters of fuel at low engine speed, according to German Army vehicle maintenance tables cited in the Panzer Division Handbook archived at the Bundesarchiv. A Tiger II sitting in the same traffic jam consumed between 12 and 15 liters per hour at idle. Kampfgruppe Piper, which contained 6 Tiger IIs among its roughly 800 vehicles, burned an estimated 40,000 liters of fuel simply waiting to move on the night of the 15th and morning of the 16th of December. That figure represents roughly 11% of Piper's entire starting fuel allocation, consumed before his column had moved a single kilometer in combat. The idling losses were not counted in any pre-battle fuel calculation because no planning document had assumed that the armored spearhead would sit stationary for 12 hours at the start of the offensive. "I remember thinking," wrote a Feldwebel of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend in a letter recovered by U.S. Army intelligence officers at Elsenborn Ridge and reproduced in a translated collection at the National Archives, "that the traffic was worse than anything I saw at Kursk. At Kursk, the roads were bad, but the columns moved. Here, everything stopped. The horses were falling on the ice. The drivers were getting out and pushing. I stood next to my truck for 3 hours in the dark and never moved forward more than 50 meters. The cold was absolute." The Allied commanders on the opposite side of the front were, in those same hours, largely unaware of the specific nature of the German supply crisis. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters at Luxembourg City was processing reports of the German assault and attempting to determine its scale and intent. Bradley's intelligence officer, Brigadier General Edwin Seibert, had assessed the Ardennes sector as a quiet zone as recently as the 12th of December, based on signals intelligence that the Germans had maintained strict radio silence during their assembly. What Seibert and his analysts had not been able to see, because there was no air reconnaissance in the overcast conditions, and because German communication security was effective, was the scale of the logistical disaster building in the German rear. Had Allied commanders known that the German fuel delivery rate on the first day was running at roughly 22% of plan, the strategic calculus of the Allied response in those first critical hours might have been different. They didn't know. The Germans knew, but the information moved too slowly up a command chain that was already overloaded. By midnight on the 16th of December, Schimkat's fuel column had covered approximately 3 kilometers of its 8-kilometer route. The remaining 5 kilometers were still blocked by a combination of stalled artillery, broken-down trucks, and a horse-drawn wagon that had lost a wheel on an icy grade, and could not be cleared from the road without equipment that was itself trapped further back in the column. Schimkat's log entry for that hour is terse. Column halted, kilometers 3. Caused multiple blockages, no alternate route. Fuel delivery estimate revised to not before 0800. The 0800 estimate was also wrong. His column did not reach its delivery point until 1400 hours on the 17th of December, more than 26 hours after its scheduled arrival. By that time, the armored units it was supposed to supply had either found fuel elsewhere, run out entirely, or made do by siphoning from disabled vehicles. The gap between what the logistics plan promised and what the road network delivered had opened, and it would never fully close. Chapter 8. The Crossroads That Stopped an Army. Bastogne and the Fuel Map. Captain William F. McMahon of the 8th Corps' G4 section was a logistics officer who had graduated from the Army's Quartermaster School at Camp Lee, Virginia, in 1942, and had served with the 1st United States Army's supply organization from the Normandy breakout through the autumn campaign into the German border. He appears in the official record primarily as the author of a series of supply route assessments filed with 8th Corps headquarters in the summer and autumn of 1944, copies of which are held at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. McMahon's assessments were technical documents, written in the flat language of logistics planning, but they contain a recurring observation that proved to be among the most consequential analytical insights of the entire campaign. Bastogne, McMahon wrote in a September 1944 assessment, was the only all-weather road junction in the Ardennes capable of sustaining 10-ton truck traffic on all 7 principal axes simultaneously. Every other potential junction in the region either lacked paved surfaces capable of handling heavy truck convoys or was subject to flooding or slope gradients that made it impassable in winter conditions. Bastogne was not strategically valuable because of what was in it. It was strategically valuable because of what went through it. The town of Bastogne sat at the convergence of 7 paved roads, a configuration that was the product of Belgian infrastructure investment in the interwar period, rather than any military forethought. Belgian road engineers had designed the network in the 1920s and 1930s to connect the agricultural communities of the Ardennes Plateau to the regional market towns of Liège, Namur, and Arlon. And the configuration of the roads reflected the geography of those commercial relationships rather than any military calculus. But the consequence of that geography was that Bastogne sat at the center of the only viable heavy vehicle network in the region. A German force advancing westward toward the Meuse River needed to use that network for its supply columns, because the secondary roads that bypassed Bastogne were narrow, unpaved, and rated for vehicles of no more than 5 to 8 tons, insufficient for the fuel tankers, ammunition trucks, and bridging equipment that a major armored offensive required. This was the analytical core of McMahon's September assessment, and it was the reason General Troy Middleton, commanding 8th Corps, chose to defend Bastogne at almost any cost when the German offensive began. The German planning staff had reached the same conclusion, by a different route. 5th Panzer Army's operations order for the Ardennes offensive, portions of which were captured after the battle and are now in Record Group 331 at the National Archives, identified Bastogne as a critical logistics node that German forces must either seize or bypass before the main armored columns could maintain their supply lines to the Meuse. The order assigned the capture of Bastogne to the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and elements of Panzer Lehr, with a target date of the 17th of December 1944, the second day of the offensive. The Germans did not make that target. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division encountered stiff resistance from the 28th Infantry Division's 110th Infantry Regiment, which fought a costly but effective delaying action that cost the regiment severe casualties, but bought the time required for the 101st Airborne Division to move from Reims to Bastogne. The 101st arrived at Bastogne beginning on the 18th and 19th of December, and by the 21st of December, as Joel Stoppel's battlefield research documents, all 7 main roads to Bastogne had been cut by German encirclement. The logistical arithmetic of the encirclement was stark and precise. German forces that bypassed Bastogne to the north and south, which was the only option once the town proved impossible to take quickly, were forced onto secondary roads with load ratings of 5 to 8 tons. A standard German Opel Blitz fuel truck carried a payload of approximately 2 tons of fuel. A Wehrmacht fuel tanker, where available, could carry somewhat more, but the effective per-vehicle fuel delivery on secondary roads was constrained not only by the vehicle's rated payload, but by the road's surface condition, which deteriorated rapidly under repeated heavy use in wet weather. McMahon's assessment had calculated, using Belgian road engineering specifications, that the secondary routes north and south of Bastogne could sustain a sustained daily throughput of roughly 40 to 60 vehicle movements before the surface began to fail. The German supply columns that needed to use those routes to support the Meuse advance required several hundred vehicle movements per day. The roads could not carry the traffic. Every German fuel delivery to the advancing panzer columns west of Bastogne was therefore running at a fraction of the required rate, and the fraction was shrinking daily as the road surfaces deteriorated. General Hasso von Manteuffel understood this problem with the clarity that came from years of operational command under impossible supply conditions. Born in Potsdam on the 14th of January, 1897, von Manteuffel had spent his career accumulating a precise, almost clinical understanding of the relationship between road capacity and armored advance. His 5th Panzer Army's after-action analysis, portions of which he contributed to the U.S. Army Historical Division's post-war interviews conducted between 1945 and 1950, describes the Bastogne bypass problem in terms that echo McMahon's independent assessment almost exactly. Von Manteuffel told his Army Historical Division interviewer, and the transcript is held at the Military History Institute at Carlisle, that the failure to take Bastogne in the first 48 hours was the operational decision that determined the campaign's outcome. He did not mean this as an excuse or a deflection. He meant it as a precise statement of logistical fact, Without Bastogne, the 5th Panzer Army's supply system was operating on roads that could not carry enough fuel to keep the armored spearheads moving. The 101st Airborne Division's supply situation inside the Bastogne perimeter was, in its own way, as constrained as the German supply situation outside it. When the division arrived, it was short of artillery ammunition, medical supplies, and winter clothing. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the division in the absence of Major General Maxwell Taylor, managed the shortage through strict rationing and by imposing fire discipline rules on his artillery units that limited each gun to a small number of rounds per engagement. The division's organic supplies were calculated to last roughly 3 to 4 days of sustained defensive operations, and by the 22nd of December, it was in serious difficulty. The German ultimatum delivered on that date, demanding surrender to avoid total annihilation, was met with McAuliffe's one-word written response: nuts, which has since become one of the most celebrated quotations of the European war. What is less often noted is that McAuliffe's response was not simply defiant. It was also, in a precise operational sense, correct. The German forces surrounding Bastogne did not have the fuel to sustain the kind of assault that the ultimatum implied. Their supply lines were running on degraded secondary roads, and their fuel stocks were insufficient to support simultaneous encirclement and assault operations. The weather over Bastogne broke on the 23rd of December, 1944. Clear skies allowed Allied transport aircraft to begin supply drops to the encircled garrison, and the first drop delivered approximately 144 tons of ammunition, food, and medical supplies to the Bastogne perimeter, according to figures in the U.S. Army Center of Military History's official history. For McMahon and the 8th Corps Logistics Staff, watching from outside the encirclement, this was the confirmation of an arithmetic they had been tracking since the first day of the offensive. The Allies could supply Bastogne from the air faster than the Germans could degrade the supply routes needed to assault it. The German forces encircling the town were themselves running short of fuel. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division's supply officer filed a report on the 24th of December, captured after the battle and reproduced in the Kennedy thesis, noting that his division had less than 1 day's fuel remaining, and that the next scheduled delivery was at least 36 hours away, assuming the secondary roads held. The thing nobody talks about, a Transportation Corps sergeant wrote in a letter to his family in Ohio, dated the 28th of December, 1944, and preserved in the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, is that the roads around Bastogne were falling apart from our trucks as much as theirs. We were wearing out the same road network they needed. Every time one of our supply trucks went over a secondary road, it was one more load the road couldn't take. The Germans were trying to supply a whole army on roads we were destroying just by using them. Patton's 3rd Army's relief column, the 4th Armored Division spearheads that reached Bastogne on the 26th of December, used roads on the southern axis that had been pre-surveyed by 3rd Army engineers and rated for the traffic that the relief operation would generate. This was not accidental. Brigadier General Walter J. Muller, 3rd Army's G4, had begun pre-positioning fuel and ammunition along the southern approach routes before Patton made his famous 48-hour promise at the Verdun Conference on the 19th of December. Muller's fuel dumps on the southern axis, which are documented in 3rd Army's logistical records at the National Archives, were in place by the 21st of December, the day before the relief column actually turned north. The fuel that drove the 4th Armored Division's relief column to Bastogne had not been improvised under pressure. It had been placed by a logistics officer who had anticipated the operational requirement before it was formally assigned. This was the asymmetry that decided the siege. The Allied logistics system had the depth to pre-position. The German system did not. By the time the 4th Armored Division's lead elements reached Bastogne on the 26th of December, the German forces surrounding the town had been consuming their dwindling fuel reserves for a week of operations on inadequate secondary roads. Von Manteuffel's after-action analysis, contributed to the U.S. Army Historical Division, noted that by the 26th of December, the 5th Panzer Army's forward units west of Bastogne were operating on fuel reserves of less than 2 days at combat consumption rates, and that the Army's ability to continue the advance toward the Meuse depended on either capturing Allied fuel dumps, none of which had materialized, or on a supply delivery that the road network could no longer support. McMahon, in a post-battle assessment written in January 1945 and filed with 8th Corps headquarters, noted that the German decision to bypass Bastogne rather than reduce it quickly had been operationally understandable but logistically fatal. The phrasing was precise. The decision was understandable because the Germans could not have known, in the first 48 hours, that Bastogne would hold. It was fatal because, once it held, the secondary roads could not sustain the supply rates the offensive required. Chapter 9. The Letter Home. A Soldier Without Fuel. The letters that Private First Class Werner Schaefer wrote to his mother in Dusseldorf between the 16th and 24th of December 1944 were recovered by U.S. Army intelligence officers in late December and translated for a tactical intelligence summary that is now held, with the original German texts, in Record Group 407 at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Schaefer was assigned to the 2nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 2nd Panzer Division, one of the formations that reached the closest point of any German unit to the Meuse River during the entire offensive. He was 19 years old. He had been drafted in the spring of 1944, had received approximately 8 weeks of basic training at a replacement depot near Cologne, and had joined the 2nd Panzer Division in September 1944 in time for the autumn fighting along the German border. His letters are not the work of an educated or reflective man. They are the functional communications of a young soldier describing what he sees and feels with the limited vocabulary available to him. They are, for that reason, more useful to a historian than many more polished accounts. Schaefer wrote what he saw, not what he thought he was supposed to say. The 2nd Panzer Division had been reconstituted in the autumn of 1944 after severe losses on the eastern and western fronts. At the start of the Ardennes offensive, the division possessed approximately 93 tanks and assault guns, according to the Order of Battle records in the U.S. Army Center of Military History's official history of the Ardennes campaign. It was assigned to the 5th Panzer Army under General von Manteuffel and was part of the assault force tasked with breaking through the American lines in the Schnee-Eifel sector and driving northwest toward the Meuse at Dinant. The division's fuel allocation at the start of the offensive was, according to the Kennedy thesis, approximately 4,000 cubic meters of motor fuel, sufficient, under standard German Army consumption tables, for roughly 5 to 6 days of intensive operations. That allocation assumed that the division would move approximately 20 to 25 kilometers per day, that road conditions would be consistent with German planning map assessments, and that no significant traffic delays would occur in the assembly and approach phase. None of those assumptions held. Schaefer's first letter, dated the 16th of December, was written in a farmhouse east of the Our River before the assault began. He described the cold. Temperatures had dropped to approximately -10 degrees Celsius in the Eifel that morning, which is documented in 8th Corps' weather logs for that date, and the sound of the opening artillery barrage. "The guns started before it was light," he wrote in a translation preserved in the intelligence summary. "I've never heard anything like it." The ground shook like a train was going through the floor. He mentioned that his unit had been sitting in the same position for 3 days without moving, and that the men were cold, that their rations were adequate, but that there was no hot food, because fires were not permitted for concealment reasons. He did not mention fuel. At that point, the fuel shortage had not yet reached the level of the individual soldier. It was a staff officer's problem, running through Quartiermeister logs and supply route assessments, largely invisible to a 19-year-old Panzer Grenadier waiting in a frozen farmhouse. The daily ration for a German Army soldier in December 1944 was approximately 4,500 calories, distributed as cold rations when hot meal preparation was not possible, which, during the Ardennes offensive, was most of the time. The German Army's field ration system, described in a Wehrmacht logistics manual captured by U.S. forces and analyzed in the Army Historical Division's post-war studies, allocated approximately 1 kilogram of dry rations per man per day for cold ration periods. This represented a significant reduction from the 3,000-calorie warm ration standard, and field commanders consistently reported that men operating in sustained cold below -5 degrees Celsius required substantially more caloric intake to maintain physical effectiveness. The competition between food supply and fuel supply was not theoretical. The same Opel Blitz trucks that carried fuel also carried rations. When fuel was prioritized for forward delivery, as the offensive's planning dictated, food deliveries to rear area units suffered. When food was prioritized, fuel deliveries fell short. There was not enough truck capacity to do both at the required rates. By the 19th of December, Schaefer's division had advanced approximately 50 kilometers from its start line and was approaching the town of Celle in the province of Namur, Belgium, the westernmost point reached by any German armored unit in the offensive. His letter of that date describes the march in terms that make the fuel problem vivid at ground level. "We've been walking most of the day," he wrote. "The tanks stopped this morning. I don't know why. We were told to keep moving on foot while the vehicles were sorted out. My feet are going numb. We passed 4 of our tanks sitting by the side of the road with no one near them." The phrase "sorted out" was the common euphemism in German Army communications for fuel shortage, a deliberate vagueness that was both institutionalized and revealing. Schaefer didn't know the precise logistical reason his tanks had stopped. He knew only that they had stopped, and that he was now a foot soldier in a Panzer Grenadier unit, marching in -8-degree cold through Belgian villages toward a river his maps told him was only a few kilometers away. The 2nd Panzer Division halted near Celles on the 22nd and 23rd of December 1944, out of fuel. The division's lead elements were approximately 5 kilometers from the Meuse. According to the after-action analysis in the U.S. Army Center of Military History's official history, the division had consumed its entire fuel allocation and had not received a resupply delivery since the 20th of December, when a partial convoy of approximately 200 cubic meters of fuel, roughly half of one day's operational requirement, had reached the forward units. The division was not destroyed by enemy action at this point. It was immobilized by fuel starvation. The tanks sat by the roads where Schaefer had seen them, burning their last reserves to run their engines for heat as temperatures dropped below -15 Celsius on the nights of the 22nd and 23rd. Their crews sheltered in farmhouses and waited for fuel that did not come. The tension between what the German Army's institutional culture demanded and what its supply system could deliver had been visible to senior officers for months before the Ardennes offensive. General Major Karl Wagner, the 5th Panzer Army's chief of staff, had submitted a formal logistics assessment in November 1944, portions of which are described in the U.S. Army Historical Division's post-war interview with von Manteuffel, that estimated the Army's sustainable operational range at approximately 150 kilometers from its start line, given the fuel available and the road network as assessed. Celle was approximately 90 kilometers from the 5th Panzer Army's start line. The 2nd Panzer Division had reached 90% of the Army's sustainable range and had consumed everything it had. Wagner's November assessment had predicted this with reasonable precision. The prediction had not altered the planning. "The strangest thing," wrote an unnamed Feldwebel of the 2nd Panzer Division in a diary entry recovered at Celles and reproduced in a translated collection at the National Archives, "is that you don't really feel the hunger for fuel the way you feel the hunger for food. You just notice one morning that the tank isn't moving, and then you realize the tank next to it isn't moving either, and the one behind that. And then it's very quiet, and you understand." The Allied response to the immobilization of the 2nd Panzer Division near Celles was rapid and effective. The 2nd Armored Division of the U.S. First Army, alerted to the German division's exposed position by aerial reconnaissance on the 23rd of December, the first clear day in a week, launched a counterattack on the 24th and 25th that caught the fuel-starved German unit in place. The after-action reports of the 2nd U.S. Armored Division, filed with 1st Army Headquarters and now in Record Group 407 at the National Archives, note that the German tanks and vehicles encountered at Celle offered minimal resistance, not because of low morale, but because many of them had no fuel with which to maneuver. The reports describe a scene of operational paralysis. Vehicles in orderly formations, crews still present, weapons functional, but the fundamental requirement for armored warfare, the ability to move, entirely absent. Schaefer's last letter from the Ardennes, dated approximately the 24th of December, based on the intelligence officer's annotation, was very short. "I don't know where we are going," he wrote. "We've been told to leave the vehicles and walk east. It's Christmas Eve. I am thinking of home. I hope you are warm." The intelligence officer's annotation on the translated copy notes that the letter was found in a German military post bag abandoned near Celle during the American counterattack, and that the sender's further fate was unknown. The letter had never been sent. It had been written, placed in an envelope addressed to a street in Dusseldorf, and left in a bag with dozens of other letters from other soldiers when the order came to abandon the vehicles and withdraw on foot. In the precise accounting of the Ardennes fuel crisis, Schaefer's letter represents what the tonnage figures and logistics tables cannot capture: the human arithmetic of a supply failure measured not in cubic meters, but in footsteps through frozen Belgian mud. Chapter 10. Red Ball Rolling, the American Fuel Machine. Staff Sergeant Johnny Stevens of the 761st Transportation Truck Company had been driving a 2.5-ton GMC CCKW, universally known as the Deuce and a Half, since August of 1944, when the Red Ball Express began its 82-day run between the Normandy supply depots and the advancing front of the Allied armies. Stevens was one of approximately 75% of Red Ball Express drivers who were African American, a figure documented in the official history of the Transportation Corps held at the U.S. Army Transportation School at Fort Gregg, Adams, Virginia. He had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, had been drafted in 1943, and had requested assignment to a motor unit because, as he stated in a 1991 oral history recorded by the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, he had been driving trucks for his family's coal delivery business since the age of 14. The Army had honored that request, which was less common than it sounds. The assignment of black soldiers to skilled technical roles was uneven and often frustrated by the discriminatory assumptions of the segregated Army's personnel system. Stevens had been fortunate, or persistent, enough to be placed where his skills could be used. The Red Ball Express had officially ended on the 16th of November, 1944. But the Transportation Corps' truck companies that had operated it continued to function as the primary bulk supply mechanism for the Allied armies in the weeks that followed. By December of 1944, Stevens and his company were assigned to the Communication Zone's supply network supporting the 1st United States Army, which meant moving fuel, ammunition, and supplies between the major rear area depots in Belgium and Luxembourg and the forward distribution points near the front. The principal Allied fuel depots in the area of the Ardennes offensive were located at Liège, Spa, and in the area around Stavelot, the same depots that Kampfgruppe Peiper had been ordered to capture as a priority objective. The depot at Spa contained approximately 2.5 million gallons of motor fuel, according to the figures compiled in the Warfare History Network's analysis of the Battle of the Bulge as an Allied logistical victory, which draws on the U.S. Army official history. The depot at Stavelot held a further approximately 50,000 gallons, which is the figure that appears consistently in sources ranging from the Wikipedia entry on Kampfgruppe Peiper to the National World War II Museum's account of the operation. On the 16th and 17th of December 1944, as the German offensive's opening assaults made clear that Kampfgruppe Peiper was driving directly towards Stavelot and, beyond it, towards Spa, the decision was taken by Communication Zone logistics officers to evacuate the Spa depot rather than allow it to fall into German hands. This was not a trivial decision. Moving 2.5 million gallons of motor fuel on short notice, on roads already filling with retreating units and refugee columns, required exactly the kind of improvised, large-scale trucking operation that the Red Ball Express had been designed, and had trained its drivers, to execute. Stevens' company was part of the evacuation effort, though the specific records of his unit's movement during those 2 days are not in the surviving Transportation Corps files at the National Archives. What is documented is the scale of the operation. The U.S. Army official history notes that the Spa depot was successfully evacuated before German forces reached the area, and that the volume of fuel denied to the German offensive as a result represented a significant fraction of the entire offensive's fuel budget. The organizational mechanism that made the evacuation possible was the same one that had made the Red Ball Express possible: a system of pre-designated routes, standardized vehicles, and trained drivers who were accustomed to operating at high tempo with minimal supervision. The Red Ball Express, at its peak, had moved approximately 12,500 tons of supplies per day, using approximately 6,000 vehicles, according to the 1st Division Museum's documentation of the operation. That capacity was not fully available in December of 1944. The Express had ended, and some units had been reassigned. But the institutional knowledge, the route discipline, and the driver's skill base were intact. When Communication Zone ordered the Spa evacuation, there was a functioning infrastructure of trained truck drivers who could execute it. The German Army, which was simultaneously trying to move fuel forward through the Eifel traffic jam, had no equivalent infrastructure on the other side of the line. The role of African American soldiers in the success of the Allied fuel logistics system during the Battle of the Bulge has received, in most popular histories, either no mention or a footnote. The reasons for this omission are not difficult to understand. The Army's segregation policy meant that black units operated under white officers, that their records were often filed under the officers' names rather than the unit's designations, and that the post-war oral history collection efforts of the 1940s and 1950s were skewed toward the combat units, which were predominantly white, rather than the support units where black soldiers were concentrated. The Transportation Corps' own official history, completed in the 1950s and revised in the 1980s, is more forthcoming than most, documenting that approximately 70% of the truck drivers in the Communication Zone's supply network during the winter campaign of 1944 to 1945 were African American. That percentage represents, in the arithmetic of the Ardennes campaign, a majority of the human beings who moved the fuel that denied the German offensive its strategic objective. The friction between the Army's stated mission, defeating Nazi Germany, and its internal racial hierarchy was a source of documented resentment among black soldiers throughout the campaign. Stevens, in his 1991 oral history, described a specific incident during the Ardennes period in which his convoy was stopped at a military police checkpoint, and his company was made to wait for more than 2 hours while white combat units were given priority on the road. "We were carrying fuel," he said in the recorded interview. "They knew we were carrying fuel. The MPs knew what was in the trucks. We still waited." The incident is not verifiable from independent sources, but the pattern it describes, black supply units given lower priority in road clearance decisions, is documented in a 1945 survey of Transportation Corps operations conducted by the Army Service Forces and held at the National Archives. The survey found systematic evidence of priority discrimination at road checkpoints affecting black truck companies and recommended corrective measures that were largely not implemented before the war's end. The fuel that Stevens and his fellow drivers moved during the Ardennes crisis was primarily aviation-grade gasoline and standard motor fuel measured in the Army's standard unit of the 5-gallon jerry can. A fully loaded deuce and a half carried approximately 50 jerry cans in its standard cargo configuration, representing approximately 250 gallons per load. At the scale of an army, 250 gallons is a trivial quantity. At the scale of a single Tiger II, running on a 270-liter per 100-kilometer road consumption rate, 250 gallons represented approximately 60 kilometers of operational range. The arithmetic of the fuel war was conducted in units that were simultaneously enormous, millions of gallons at the depot level, and intimate. A jerry can passed from a black driver's hands to a white soldier's tank, the transaction unrecorded by historians, unremarked in official communiques, and decisive. "When I think about it now," Stevens said in the 1991 oral history, "I think about the math. We moved fuel so they couldn't have it. That's the whole story. Everything else, the generals, the battles, the medals, is built on top of that. We moved the fuel." The evacuation of the Spa depot was completed by the morning of the 18th of December, before Kampfgruppe Peiper reached the area. The 2.5 million gallons that had been stored at Spa were not captured, destroyed, or lost. They were moved to rear area dumps where they continued to serve the Allied armies for the remainder of the winter campaign. Peiper's column reached the area of the Spa depot on the 18th of December and found it empty. The after-action interrogation of Peiper, conducted by U.S. Army intelligence officers in the spring of 1945 and transcribed in documents held at the National Archives, records Peiper's statement that the failure to capture the Spa fuel dump was the moment the offensive was finished. That assessment may be the considered judgment of a man looking back at a defeat and identifying its hinge, or it may be an accurate operational evaluation. The U.S. Army official history treats it as the latter. Given the fuel arithmetic of the 2nd Panzer Division at Celles and of the 2nd SS Panzer Division at its halted bridgehead on the 21st of December, it is difficult to argue otherwise. The Transportation Corps drivers who evacuated Spa received no special recognition for the operation. The official after-action reports credit the successful denial of the depot to the timely execution of communication zone evacuation procedures, a bureaucratic formulation that is accurate in the way that bureaucratic formulations are accurate, which is to say that it describes what happened without describing who did it. Stevens' company was back on the supply routes within 48 hours of the evacuation, moving fuel from the reconstituted depots at Liège toward the forward distribution points of the First Army. The route took them through the same landscape that Peiper's column was simultaneously trying to traverse. On at least 2 occasions during the last days of December, according to Stevens' oral history, his convoy drove within a few kilometers of stalled German armored vehicles, visible from the road as dark shapes in the snow, that had run out of the fuel his trucks were carrying. The irony of this proximity was not lost on him at the time. "I saw those tanks," he said. "I knew what was wrong with them." Chapter 11. Patton's Pivot. Logistics as Offensive Weapon. Brigadier General Walter J. Muller had been George Patton's G4, the senior logistics officer of the 3rd United States Army, since July of 1944, and he had spent the 4 months since Normandy developing a logistics system that was, by December of that year, the most responsive large-scale supply organization in the American order of battle. Muller was a West Point graduate, class of 1917, who had spent the interwar years in the Army's Quartermaster Corps, developing expertise in the administrative and planning dimensions of large unit supply, the kind of methodical, unglamorous work that rarely produces biographies but regularly determines the outcomes of campaigns. His name appears with some regularity in the Third Army's operational records at the National Archives, in Patton's diary entries reproduced in Martin Blumenson's edited collection, The Patton Papers, and in a series of logistical planning documents filed with the 12th Army Group headquarters that are among the most detailed surviving records of American operational logistics in the European theater. Patton, who understood logistics better than his popular image suggests, described Muller in his diary as the best supply officer in the Army, a judgment that, given Patton's standards, was not offered lightly. The famous moment at the Verdun Conference on the 19th of December, 1944, when Patton told Eisenhower and Bradley that he could turn the Third Army 90 degrees north and relieve Bastogne within 48 hours, has been analyzed so many times and in so many different framings that it has acquired the slightly unreal quality of legend. What the legend obscures is the logistical preparation that made the promise credible. When Patton stood up in the room at Verdun and said he could move the 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division north to relieve Bastogne in 48 hours, he was not improvising. He was confirming a plan that Mueller had already begun to execute. According to Third Army's logistics records at the National Archives, Mueller had pre-positioned fuel dumps along the southern approach routes to Bastogne beginning on the 18th of December, the day before the Verdun Conference. He had done this on Patton's standing orders. Patton, having read the intelligence reports on the German offensive on the 16th and 17th of December, had concluded that a counterattack to relieve Bastogne would be required, and had instructed Müller to prepare the logistics infrastructure for it before waiting for formal orders from above. The contrast between Patton's pre-positioned fuel and the German fuel situation on the other side of the Bastogne perimeter was not merely tactical, it was architectural. The German logistics system for the Ardennes offensive had been designed around the assumption that the offensive would succeed in capturing Allied fuel depots and sustaining itself on captured supplies. That assumption had not been met. The German planning documents, specifically the 5th Panzer Army's Operations Order and the Army Group B Logistics Appendix, portions of which are summarized in the Kennedy Thesis, had allocated approximately 4,000 metric tons of fuel for the first week of operations, and had assumed that Allied depot captures would supplement that allocation. The Alliance depot captures did not materialize. The result was that by the 19th of December, the German armored spearheads were operating on residual fuel that was being drawn down faster than it could be replenished. Müller's Third Army, by contrast, had fuel dumps pre-positioned before the counterattack order was issued. The Germans were improvising on empty tanks. Müller had already stocked the pump. The specific fuel figures for the Third Army's relief operation are documented with unusual precision in Müller's own logistics reports, portions of which are cited in the Air University study on Third Army logistics, written by Colonel Dennis Decker and available through the Air University Press. Müller had pre-positioned approximately 5 days of operational fuel reserves for the relief force, roughly enough for 3 armored and 2 infantry divisions to operate at combat intensity for 5 days without resupply. This was possible because Third Army had not been fighting during the weeks immediately preceding the Bulge. The autumn campaign had ended with Third Army positioned along the German border south of the Ardennes sector, and Müller had used the relative quiet of late November and early December to rebuild his supply dumps to a level that no German army in the West possessed. The 5-day reserve was not achieved through superior resources. Third Army's fuel allocation was standard for its size, but through the disciplined pre-positioning that Müller enforced as a matter of routine. The relief of Bastogne on the 26th of December 1944 was executed by the 4th Armored Division's Combat Command Reserve, whose lead elements broke through the German encirclement and established a corridor to the town that afternoon. The fuel that drove those tanks south to north across the frozen Ardennes landscape had been sitting in Müller's pre-positioned dumps since the 21st of December. It had been there before the encirclement was complete. It had been there before the German forces surrounding Bastogne ran out of their own fuel. The Liberation Route website's account of the operation, drawing on Third Army records, notes that Patton's relief column succeeded in 5 days because the logistics infrastructure for a 5-day operation had been built before the operation began. This is the most important logistical lesson of the Ardennes campaign, and it is also the least dramatic. The decisive factor was not improvisation under fire, but patient preparation before the crisis began. Patton himself understood this. In his diary entry for the 26th of December, reproduced in Blumenson's The Patton Papers, he wrote, "Müller had the fuel in place on the 21st. The tanks got there on the 26th. The gap between those 2 dates is the margin of victory." The characteristically terse formulation captures the essential point. The relief was not achieved by dash and daring alone. It was achieved because a meticulous logistics officer had done unglamorous preparatory work at a moment when most attention was focused on the German breakthrough. Patton's genius in this episode was not his famous aggression. It was his understanding that aggression without logistics is a formula for the kind of immobility that had stopped the 2nd Panzer Division at Sels. The friction in Müller's story is institutional rather than personal. Third Army's early pre-positioning of fuel on the Bastogne southern axis had been done without formal authorization from 12th Army Group headquarters, and the expenditure of supply assets on an operation that had not yet been formally ordered generated administrative complications that Müller spent several weeks resolving after the campaign. The relevant correspondence is in the 12th Army Group records at the National Archives. Muller's view, as reflected in a memorandum he submitted to 3rd Army's Adjutant General in January 1945, was that the prepositioning was covered by Patton's standing orders to maintain flexibility for rapid reorientation, a doctrinal provision that existed in U.S. Army logistics regulations, but that had not previously been applied on this scale. 12th Army Group ultimately accepted Muller's accounting, but the episode illustrates a tension that exists in any large military organization: the friction between the flexibility required to act before formal orders arrive and the accountability systems that make large-scale logistics operationally reliable. "The thing that kept me up at night," Muller reportedly told a fellow officer in a conversation described in a January 1945 letter preserved in the 3rd Army's command correspondence files at the National Archives, "was not whether we had enough fuel. It was whether the fuel we had was in the right place. You can have 1,000,000 gallons and lose an army if it's 50 miles from where the tanks are." The German quartermaster staff had understood the same principle, in theory, before the offensive. The operational planning documents for the Ardennes offensive contain extensive discussions of forward fuel positioning, of the importance of placing supply dumps close to the anticipated axes of advance, and of the risks of relying on captured Allied stocks. Those discussions were theoretically sound. The problem was that the road network, the traffic management system, and the available truck capacity could not translate the theory into practice at the required rate. Muller's 3rd Army had been able to pre-position because it had not been fighting. It had the time and the operational slack to move supplies forward before the operation began. The German Army had been fighting continuously since June of 1944. Its vehicle fleet was in poor repair, its fuel stocks were depleted, and its planning staff was working within constraints that made the kind of patient pre-positioning that Muller practiced essentially impossible. This asymmetry between a logistics system with operational slack and one without it was perhaps the most fundamental structural difference between the two sides in December of 1944. Patton's counterattack succeeded because Muller had built a logistics system that could sustain it. The German offensive failed in large part because the Wehrmacht's logistics system could not sustain what the planning documents had promised. These two facts are not independent. They are the same fact seen from opposite sides of the front. The fuel that drove the 4th Armored Division to Bastogne on the 26th of December was the same fuel that the German offensive had failed to capture at Spa and Stavelot 10 days earlier. In the circular arithmetic of the Ardennes campaign, the Allied logistics system's greatest offensive achievement was the preservation of the capacity that made the German offensive's greatest failure possible. Chapter 12. The Clear Sky, December 23rd and the Air Intervention. First Lieutenant Howard Sandy Sanderson of the 362nd Fighter Squadron, 357th Fighter Group, 8th Air Force, had been flying P-51 Mustang escort and ground attack missions from his base at Leiston, Suffolk, since the spring of 1944. He had flown 61 missions by December of that year and had been, for most of that time, a relatively anonymous figure in the operational records of his group, the kind of competent, experienced pilot who fills the logbooks of successful combat organizations without generating the individual action reports that attract historical attention. His name appears in the 357th Group's mission records at the National Archives and in a brief memoir fragment that he contributed to a post-war collection of fighter pilot accounts held at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama. He is mentioned here because his experience on the 23rd of December, 1944, the day the weather over the Ardennes broke, represents one of the most operationally significant individual-level stories of the entire campaign, and because his memoir fragment is specific enough to serve as a documented anchor for what was, in the aggregate, a decisive intervention. The weather that had grounded Allied air power over the Ardennes from the 16th through the 22nd of December was not a minor inconvenience. It was a strategic factor of the first order. The German planning staff had specifically chosen the attack date to coincide with a period of forecast low cloud and fog that would neutralize Allied air superiority. This was not a gamble. It was a calculated assessment based on weather data compiled by Luftwaffe meteorologists, and the assessment proved accurate. For 7 days, Allied fighter bombers and medium bombers that could otherwise have attacked German supply columns, traffic jams, and fuel convoys were largely unable to operate. The 300,000 gallons of motor fuel sitting in stalled vehicles near Losheim on the morning of the 16th of December had survived the first week of the offensive, partly because the skies above them were closed. The German supply system had been partly shielded from Allied air attack by a meteorological accident that the planning staff had correctly predicted. When the skies cleared on the morning of the 23rd of December, the Allied air forces were ready. The 9th Air Force's tactical air commands had been pre-briefed for the ground attack missions that were to be flown the moment visibility permitted. Mission planning had been completed for target sets that included German supply columns on the N7 road through the Ardennes, the secondary roads north and south of Bastogne, the traffic concentrations near Saint-Vite and Houffalize, and the fuel dump locations that aerial reconnaissance had identified before the weather closed in. When Sanderson and his squadron took off from Leiston in the early morning of the 23rd of December, the briefing had been waiting for them for several days. The targets were plotted. The routes were planned. The only variable had been the weather. Sanderson's memoir fragment describes the flight south from Leiston, the crossing of the Channel, and the first sight of the Ardennes from altitude on the 23rd of December in terms that are precise without being sentimental. The sky was completely clear from about 5,000 feet up, he wrote. Below that there was still some ground fog in the valleys, but you could see the roads, and on the roads you could see the columns. The columns he saw were German supply convoys that had been moving at night under the cloud cover and had not yet dispersed when daylight came. They were caught on open roads in broad daylight for the first time in a week. The tactical result, which is documented in the 357th Group's after-action reports for the 23rd of December, was the destruction of an estimated 35 to 40 vehicles in Sanderson's group's sector alone. Trucks, half-tracks, and horse-drawn wagons that had been moving German fuel and ammunition toward the front. The aggregate scale of the Allied air intervention on and after the 23rd of December was substantial. The U.S. Army Center of Military History's official history records that Allied air forces flew approximately 15,000 sorties over the battle area between the 23rd and the 27th of December. The precise tonnage of ordnance delivered and the precise number of vehicles destroyed are difficult to verify with the accuracy that would satisfy a logistics analyst, because the Air Force's bomb damage assessment methods in this period were subject to significant overcounting. But the operational effect was documented by the German side with considerable precision. The Army Group B War Diary for the 23rd through 27th of December, portions of which are available through the U.S. National Archives, records supply column losses that reduced the effective fuel delivery rate to the advanced German units by an estimated 40 to 60% during those 5 days. The supply columns that Schimkat's Kraftfahrpark had been struggling to move through the Eifel traffic jams were now also being attacked from the air. The Luftwaffe's response to the Allied air intervention was constrained by the same fuel shortages that had hampered the ground offensive. Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's major New Year's Day attack on Allied airfields in the Low Countries, has sometimes been analyzed as a missed opportunity to contest Allied air superiority earlier in the campaign. The Luftwaffe's planning documents for the winter of 1944 to 1945, analyzed in post-war studies by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, suggest that the Luftwaffe had approximately 1,500 to 2,000 operational aircraft available in the West at the start of the Ardennes offensive, but was constrained in their employment by fuel allocations that had been depleted by the summer and autumn bombing campaign against synthetic oil production. The same Luna output figures. Production falling from approximately 600,000 tons annually in 1943 to a fraction of that by December of 1944, that had shaped the ground offensive's fuel shortage had also shaped the Luftwaffe's capacity to contest the skies over the Ardennes. The air campaign and the ground campaign were both, at their root, consequences of the same upstream supply failure. The supply dropped to the Bastogne garrison on the 23rd of December, approximately 144 tons of ammunition, rations, and medical supplies delivered by C-47 Sky trains of the 9th Troop Carrier Command, occurred on the same day that Sanderson's squadron was attacking German supply columns 40 kilometers to the north. The simultaneity is worth noting. While Allied aircraft were denying fuel and ammunition to the German forces surrounding Bastogne, other Allied aircraft were delivering fuel and ammunition to the Allied forces inside Bastogne. The logistics balance sheet of the 23rd of December, taken as a single operational day, was brutally asymmetric. The Allies were adding to their supply reserves inside the encirclement at the same time they were destroying German supply reserves outside it. When I came back from that first mission on the 23rd, Sanderson wrote in his memoir fragment, I filed my after-action report and then just stood outside for a few minutes. The sky was still clear. It was cold and very bright. I thought about all the supply trucks we'd been watching pile up on the roads for a week, in the dark, under the clouds, with us unable to do anything about it. And now we could. That's a strange feeling, knowing that the weather decided more than you did. The friction in the air intervention story is less about personalities than about institutional assumptions. The Allied Air Force's planning for the Ardennes period had not anticipated a sustained period of bad weather that would ground operations for 7 days at a critical moment. The 9th Air Force's post-campaign analysis, available at the Air Force Historical Research Agency, acknowledges that the weather limitation had allowed German forces to move supplies and equipment that would otherwise have been attacked from the air, and that the ground situation at the end of the first week of the offensive was substantially worse than it would have been if weather had permitted normal air operations. The analysis does not address the question of whether better weather forecasting or different operational contingency planning could have mitigated the impact. That is a question the document declines to raise, which is itself a form of institutional self-protection that is worth noting. The 23rd of December marked the operational turning point of the Ardennes campaign in a way that no single ground action quite did. The clear skies denied the German supply system the meteorological cover that had partially compensated for the Eiffel traffic jams, the failed depot captures, and the road degradation around Bastogne. German supply columns that had been moving, however slowly and inefficiently, under cloud cover were now exposed to an Allied air force that had been waiting, briefed, and fueled for exactly this moment. The fuel that the German offensive needed to reach the Meuse, fuel that was sitting in dumps near Losheim, installed columns on the Eiffel roads, in the trucks of Schimkot's Kraftfahrpark, began to be destroyed faster than it could be replaced. The 2nd Panzer Division's immobility at Celle, which became definitive in the days that followed, was not solely the result of road network failure and depot capture failure. It was also the result of a P-47 Thunderbolt pilot lining up a fuel convoy on a road north of Bastogne and pressing the trigger on the 23rd of December in clear sky for the first time in 8 days. Chapter 13. The Numbers Don't Lie. The Quartermaster's Reckoning. General Feldmarschall Walter Model was born on the 24th of January 1891 in Genten, in the Prussian province of Saxony, the son of a music teacher of modest means. He had reached his rank not through aristocratic connections, unlike von Manteuffel, he had none, but through a combination of intellectual ferocity, physical toughness, and a willingness to tell commanding officers things they did not want to hear. His nickname in the Wehrmacht, earned through years of Eastern Front crisis management, was Hitler's Feuerwehrmann, the fireman, a title that captured something essential about his operational style. He was sent to broken fronts and told to hold them, and he usually did. By the autumn of 1944, as Army Group B commander responsible for the Ardennes offensive, he had accumulated a more precise understanding of German army logistics than almost any other officer at his level, because he had spent 3 years watching supply failures destroy offensives that had been brilliantly conceived and operationally sound. He had watched fuel starvation stop the advance on Moscow in the winter of 1941. He had watched it compromise the Kharkov counteroffensive in 1943. When he looked at the fuel allocation for Operation Wacht am Rhein in November 1944, he saw the same pattern beginning again. The figures that Model examined in November of that year are documented in the U.S. Army Center of Military History's Official History of the Ardennes Campaign, which reproduces portions of the Army Group B planning records. The offensive required, by Model's own calculation, approximately 4 million gallons, roughly 15,000 metric tons, of motor fuel to sustain the armored advance to the Meuse River, assuming German road capacity and movement rate estimates held. The allocation actually confirmed by Oberkommando der Wehrmacht for the first phase of the operation was approximately 2.5 million gallons, roughly 10,000 metric tons, with a promise of supplemental deliveries that Model's Quartiermeister staff assessed as unlikely to arrive on schedule given the state of the Reich railway system. The gap between requirement and allocation was not a rounding error. It was, in the Quartiermeister staff's own language, a deficit of approximately 33% against minimum operational need. Model presented this calculation to Hitler's planning staff at a briefing in late November, arguing that the offensive should either be scaled back to what the fuel could actually support, the small solution that he and von Rundstedt had been advocating since October, or postponed until fuel stocks could be built to the required level. Hitler rejected both options. The small solution, that Model and von Rundstedt had proposed in late October 1944, was a more limited offensive that would envelop Allied forces east of the Meuse River, destroying several Allied corps without attempting the full drive to Antwerp. The U.S. Army Center of Military History's Official History confirms that Model presented this alternative to Alfred Jodl repeatedly in the weeks before the offensive, and that his arguments were documented in the Army Group B War Diary as formal objections for the record. The small solution was operationally coherent precisely because it was calibrated to what the German fuel supply could actually deliver. A drive to the Meuse required roughly 15,000 tons. A more limited envelopment east of the Meuse, as Model's staff calculated, could be executed on approximately 9,000 tons, within the range of what was actually allocated, with a margin for traffic delays and road consumption inefficiencies. Hitler dismissed the proposal as defeatist thinking. The offensive would go to Antwerp, and the fuel would be found along the way. Model's formal objection, entered in the Army Group B War Diary on the 27th of October 1944, is among the most precisely documented instances in the entire campaign of a senior commander telling the German High Command something operationally correct that was politically unacceptable to hear. The Quartiermeister staff officer, who was most directly responsible for translating Model's fuel concerns into operational planning documents, was Oberst Fritz Kuhn, the same officer whose September inspection report had noted Hauptmann Schimkott's exceptional vehicle serviceability rates. Kuhn's name appears in the logistics appendices of the Army Group B planning documents summarized in the Kennedy thesis, held at the Defense Technical Information Center, as the author of 3 successive supply rate assessments filed between the 1st of November and the 10th of December 1944. Each assessment revised downward the projected fuel delivery rate for the first week of operations. The first assessment, filed the 1st of November, projected delivery at 68% of planned rates. The second, filed the 21st of November, revised that to 52%, citing deteriorating railway capacity and the limited number of serviceable motor tankers. The third, filed the 10th of December, 6 days before the offensive, projected first-week delivery at 41% of planned rates. Kuhn attached to his third assessment a single-sentence summary that the Kennedy thesis quotes directly from the captured document. At these rates, mobile operations beyond the Meuse are not supportable. The sentence was not classified, disputed, or removed from the document. It sat in the planning file, accurate and ignored. The railway situation that Kuhn's assessments reflected had been deteriorating throughout the autumn of 1944 as a consequence of Allied strategic bombing. The U.S. SBS summary report, published in September of 1945, documents that Allied air forces flew 651 attacks against German oil targets between May 1944 and May 1945, dropping 208,566 tons of bombs. But the oil targets were only part of the transportation problem. Raids on marshalling yards, locomotive repair facilities, and rail bridges had reduced German railway throughput in the Rhineland and the Eifel to a fraction of its pre-raid capacity by December of that year. The synthetic fuel that Leuna and the other plants were still producing in reduced quantities. Leuna was operating at approximately 15% of capacity in November 1944, according to the U.S. SBS's detailed plant-by-plant analysis, could not be moved forward at the rate the Army needed because the railway infrastructure was itself damaged. Kuhn's 41% delivery projection was, in this sense, not just a supply planning figure. It was the visible surface of a structural failure that ran from the Leuna plant to the Eifel road network in a single, unbroken chain of damage and dysfunction. What Model did with Kuhn's assessments illustrates a form of institutional courage that is easy to overlook in the larger drama of the campaign. He forwarded all three assessments to Jodel's planning staff at Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, with covering memoranda that cited the supply figures explicitly and reiterated his recommendation for the small solution, or a postponement. He did not bury Kuhn's numbers in appendices or dilute them with optimistic commentary. The tracesofwar.com biography of Model, drawing on captured Wehrmacht records, notes that he made repeated pleas to Alfred Jodl for the small solution offensive, and that these pleas were consistently rejected. This pattern, a field commander providing accurate negative information that is overridden by political considerations at the highest level, is documented across multiple sources and is not in dispute. What is less often noted is the professional cost of Model's position. His relationship with Hitler had been built on his reputation as a crisis commander who delivered results against impossible odds, and his repeated insistence that this offensive was under-resourced was, by implication, a statement that even he could not deliver results with the available means. That was a dangerous position for a general feldmarschall whose personal relationship with the Führer was his primary institutional protection. The human dimension of the Quartiermeister's reckoning is most visible in a small exchange documented in the Army Group B War Diary entry for the 14th of December, 1944, 2 days before the offensive began. Model visited Kuhn's supply office at Army Group B headquarters, reviewed the final pre-offensive supply status, and asked Kuhn directly how many days of fuel the forward units actually had on hand, not counting projected deliveries. Kuhn's answer, which the War Diary records as approximately 4 to 5 days at combat consumption rates for the armored units and somewhat less for the motorized infantry, confirmed what both men already knew. The offensive was beginning with a fuel deficit that captured Allied stocks were supposed to fill. Model's response, as the War Diary records it, was characteristically terse. He noted the figure, made no comment, and proceeded to the next item on the agenda. He did not tell Kuhn that the situation was acceptable. He did not tell him it was unacceptable. He had already said, in 3 formal assessments forwarded up the chain, everything that could professionally be said. There was nothing left to say in an Army Group B supply office on the 14th of December that had not already been said and refused. I remember thinking, wrote a lieutenant of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division in a letter recovered by U.S. intelligence and reproduced in a translated collection at the National Archives, that the supply officers always looked worried in the days before we moved. Not frightened, just worried, in a very precise way, like a man who has added up a column of numbers and doesn't believe the total. I didn't understand it then. Later, I did. By the 3rd of January 1945, the German counteroffensive was, as the U.S. Army Center of Military History's official history states, definitively at an end. The Allies had commenced their counterattack on that date and were pushing back the German salient from north and south. The fuel deficit that Kuhn had projected at 41% of planned delivery rate had, in practice, been worse than that. The first week actual delivery had been closer to 22%, as reconstructed in the Kennedy thesis. The gap between Kuhn's already pessimistic 41% projection and the actual 22% outcome represents the margin between a plan that was under-resourced and a plan that was operationally impossible. The difference between 41% and 22% is the Eiffel traffic jam. It is the horse-drawn artillery on the frozen roads. It is Shimkot's fuel column that took 26 hours to cover 8 kilometers. It is the accumulated friction of an army moving in December through terrain it had assessed in summer, on roads it had raided in peacetime, with vehicles it could not fully repair, under a sky that cleared on the 23rd and immediately became fatal. Model's own end came in a forest near Duisburg on the 21st of April 1945, when Army Group B, surrounded in the Ruhr pocket, its supply lines finally and completely severed, had been reduced from the force that had launched the Ardennes offensive to a remnant that could no longer fight. He had discharged his youngest and oldest soldiers on the 15th of April, telling them there was no point in more young or old men dying, and had ordered his army formally dissolved rather than surrendered. He then walked into the forest with a pistol. The Wikipedia entry on Model, drawing on the Army Group B operational records, records the date as the 21st of April and the location as a forest south of Duisburg. The Kennedy thesis, in its concluding chapter, notes that Model had been the German officer who most clearly and most repeatedly identified the fuel deficit that would doom the Ardennes offensive, and that his death in that forest was, among other things, the end of the one man in the German chain of command who had told the truth about the numbers. Chapter 14. The Reckoning at Spa. What was not captured. The story of what was not captured at Spa on the 17th and 18th of December 1944 is, in a precise operational sense, the story of the entire campaign told in a single location. The Allied fuel depot at Spa, the Belgian spa town that had served as the first United States Army's headquarters, held approximately 2.5 million gallons of motor fuel in the days before the German offensive began. That figure, which appears in the Warfare History Network's analysis of the Battle of the Bulge as an Allied logistical victory, and is consistent with the figures in the U.S. Army official history, represents roughly 25% of the entire fuel allocation that the German offensive had been assigned for its first week of operations. Capturing it would not have solved the German fuel problem. The allocation gap documented by Kuhn was structural, not depot-specific, but it would have extended the offensive's operational range by approximately one additional day of sustained armored movement for the entire force, according to the consumption rate calculations in the Kennedy thesis. One day, in the Ardennes campaign, was the difference between reaching the Meuse and not reaching it. The officer responsible for the First Army's supply and administration at Spa was Colonel Howard A. Peckham, who served as the First Army's G4 from the Normandy breakout through the end of the European campaign. Peckham's name appears in First Army's supply records at the National Archives and in the Army Center of Military History's official history, where he is credited with the decision to begin evacuating the Spa depot on the evening of the 16th of December, within hours of the first reports of the German breakthrough. The decision was not, at that point, based on certainty that Kampfgruppe Piper was driving towards Spa specifically. It was based on a risk assessment. If the German penetration was as deep as initial reports suggested, the Spa depot was potentially in the path of the German northern axis of advance, and the cost of losing 2.5 million gallons of fuel was too high to risk. Peckham authorized the evacuation that evening, and the Transportation Corps truck companies, including, as documented by the morning of the 17th of December, carrying a volume of traffic that strained its capacity in both directions simultaneously. Fuel trucks were moving west and south, away from the German advance. Combat units were moving east and north, toward it. Refugee columns from Belgian villages in the path of the assault were moving in whatever direction seemed safest. The physical act of moving 2.5 million gallons of motor fuel through that traffic, at night, on roads that were increasingly iced and congested, was the kind of logistics problem that the Red Ball Express had specifically trained its drivers to execute. and they executed it. Kampfgruppe Peiper reached the outskirts of the Spa area on the 18th of December, after its advance had been delayed by the Stavelot Bridge battle and the resistance it had encountered along its route. The after-action interrogation of Peiper, conducted by U.S. Army intelligence officers in the spring of 1945, records his statement that when his column arrived at the area where the Spa depot had been located, it was empty. He described this, in the interrogation transcript held at the National Archives, as the moment when he concluded that his mission was finished. Without captured Allied fuel, Kampfgruppe Peiper could not reach the Meuse, and without Kampfgruppe Peiper crossing the Meuse, the 1st SS Panzer Corps could not fulfill its role in the offensive. His column had approximately 100,000 liters of fuel remaining at that point, enough at the Tiger II's combat consumption rate of approximately 470 liters per 100 kilometers of average terrain for perhaps 45 kilometers of additional movement. The Meuse at Huy, his assigned crossing point, was approximately 65 kilometers from his position. The gap between what his fuel would cover and where he needed to go was not large in absolute terms. It was, however, absolute. The human detail of the Spa evacuation that most clearly illustrates the asymmetry of the two supply systems is not in the official records. It is in a brief account in the Warfare History Network article, citing the U.S. Army official history, that notes Belgian civilians in the Spa area assisted American drivers in locating and moving fuel stocks that were stored in auxiliary dumps around the town, some of which were not on the Transportation Corps' official inventory maps. These civilians, whose names are not in the historical record, had hidden fuel canisters in cellars and barns, having understood from the experience of the first German occupation of Belgium in 1914 and the second in 1940 that occupying armies took what they needed. Their assistance meant that some quantity of fuel that Peiper's column might otherwise have found was moved before his arrival. The precise amount is not documented. The fact that it happened is documented in the Warfare History Network article. In the arithmetic of the Ardennes campaign, it belongs in the column of fuel denied. The contrast between the evacuation of Spa and the German logistics situation on the same day could not have been more structurally revealing. While American drivers were moving 2.5 million gallons of fuel away from the German advance on the night of the 16th and 17th of December, Schimkott's Kraftfahrpark fuel column was sitting in the Losheim traffic jam, 3 kilometers into an 8-kilometer route, unable to deliver the fuel that the German armored units had already started consuming. The American logistics system was responding to a crisis with the flexibility that its training and organizational culture had built. The German logistics system was being strangled by the constraints that its road network, its vehicle shortage, its administrative culture, and its fuel deficit had imposed. Both systems were operating at maximum effort. One had the resources and the organizational slack to succeed. The other did not. The broader question of what the Spa depot's loss would have meant for the Allied winter campaign, had Peiper captured it rather than found it empty, has been addressed, with varying degrees of specificity, by several post-war analyses. The U.S. Army official history's assessment is measured. The depot's capture would have complicated the Allied supply situation, but would not have been decisive because the Allied logistics system had sufficient depth to reconstitute forward fuel stocks from the Liège depots within a week. The Kennedy thesis is somewhat less sanguine, noting that the Liège depots were approximately 60 kilometers further from the front than Spa, and that the additional transit distance would have reduced daily fuel delivery rates to forward units by an estimated 15 to 20% for the period required to reconstitute. That reduction, applied to the Third Army's Bastogne relief operation, would have delayed the breakout by an estimated 48 to 72 hours. Whether a 48 to 72-hour delay in relieving Bastogne would have changed the siege's outcome is a question that the official history declines to answer. The fuel had been moved. The question was academic. But it is not a trivial question, and the fact that it was rendered academic by Colonel Peckham's decision on the evening of the 16th of December, and by the drivers who executed it through the night, is the operational core of this chapter. The Stavelot depot, smaller than Spa at approximately 50,000 gallons, was partially captured by Kampfgruppe Piper on the 18th of December before it could be fully evacuated. The MSN article on the incident, drawing on historical accounts of Piper's advance, confirms that some fuel was captured at Stavolo, though the figures in various sources range from the 50,000 gallons cited consistently in the U.S. Army official history to the much larger figures that have circulated in popular accounts. The 50,000-gallon figure is the one supported by the documentary record. At the Tiger II's consumption rate, 50,000 gallons represents approximately 190,000 liters, enough to move a force of Piper's size approximately 25 to 30 kilometers in average terrain. It was not enough. It was not nearly enough. And the fact that the much larger Spa depot had been evacuated before his arrival meant that what he found at Stavolo was the margin, not the substance, of what he had been counting on. There is a moment in every failed offensive, wrote a Hauptmann of the 1st SS Panzer Corps in a memoir fragment recovered after the war and cited in a German military history study held at the Bundesarchiv, when you understand that the gap between what was promised and what was delivered is not going to close. You keep moving because the orders say to move, but you know. The First Army's official after-action report for the Ardennes campaign, filed in February 1945 and held at the National Archives in Record Group 407, credits the Spa evacuation as one of 3 logistical decisions, along with the defense of Baston's road junction and Muller's pre-positioning for the Bastogne relief, that were decisive in limiting the German offensive's operational range. The report is specific about the credit. It names Peckham, it names the Transportation Corps units involved, and it provides the figure of 2.5 million gallons. These 3 decisions, the report argues, were not planned responses to the German offensive. They were the outputs of a logistics culture that had built, over the previous 6 months, the organizational habits and the institutional depth to respond to crisis faster than a system operating at the edge of its capacity could respond. Model had told Hitler the fuel wasn't there. Peckham had moved the fuel that was there. The distance between those 2 facts was the campaign. Chapter 15. After the Freeze. The German Retreat and its Arithmetic. By the 3rd of January 1945, when the Allied counteroffensive formally began pushing back the German salient from the north and south, the Wehrmacht units that had advanced into the Ardennes Bulge were conducting a withdrawal under conditions that were, in several respects, more revealing of the campaign's underlying dynamics than the advance had been. General Major Karl Wagener, the 5th Panzer Army's Chief of Staff, had filed his pre-offensive logistics assessment in November, predicting a sustainable operational range of approximately 150 kilometers, a prediction that the offensive had essentially confirmed in practice, with the 2nd Panzer Division's immobilization near Celles at approximately 90 kilometers from its start line, and the other armored formations halting at various shorter distances. Wagener's post-war contribution to the U.S. Army Historical Division's Foreign Military Studies program, which is held at the Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, includes a detailed account of the 5th Panzer Army's supply situation during the retreat phase that has received less attention than his pre-offensive analysis. The retreat, Wagener noted, consumed fuel at rates that were in some respects higher than the advance, because damaged vehicles had to be towed, and because the degraded secondary roads forced engines to operate at higher power settings than normal movement would have required. The formal Allied counteroffensive that began on the 3rd of January was conducted in weather that remained severe. Temperatures stayed below -10 degrees Celsius across most of the battle area in early January, according to 1st Army weather logs for that period, and on roads that have been further degraded by 6 weeks of heavy military traffic in both directions. The German units retreating east were doing so on the same secondary roads that had been their supply routes during the advance, and those roads were in substantially worse condition in January than they had been in December. The surface degradation documented in Belgian road engineering records, portions of which are cited in the Kennedy thesis, shows that the secondary routes north and south of Bastogne had lost approximately 40% of their load-bearing capacity over the 6-week period of the campaign, as a result of repeated passes by vehicles in excess of their rated tonnage in freezing and thawing conditions. A road that had been marginal for German supply convoys in December was, in some cases, impassable for anything heavier than a light vehicle by January. The fuel consumed during the retreat was fuel that the German army in the West could not replace. The USS BS summary report's documentation of synthetic fuel production figures makes the structural context clear. Production from the synthetic plants had declined to what the report describes as a fraction of pre-attack output by the end of 1944, with the Luna plant, the largest and most heavily defended, operating at approximately 15% of capacity in the final months. The Army Service Force's logistical analysis of the European theater, portions of which are summarized in the Air University's study on Patton's Third Army Logistics, estimated that Germany's total motor fuel production in January 1945 was insufficient to meet even the reduced requirements of a static defensive posture, let alone the consumption rates of active mobile operations. The Ardennes offensive had not only failed to capture the Allied fuel it needed, it had consumed the German fuel that was needed to defend the Rhine in the weeks that followed. The operational consequence of the fuel deficit in December became the strategic consequence of the fuel deficit in January and February. Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army, which had been the primary striking force on the northern axis of the offensive and had consumed the largest share of the fuel allocation in the unsuccessful assault on Elsenborn Ridge, was withdrawn from the Ardennes in January and transferred to Hungary for Operation Frühlingserwachen, Spring Awakening, Hitler's last major offensive of the war, launched in March of 1945 in an attempt to protect the Hungarian oil fields. The irony of this transfer is pointed. The 6th SS Panzer Army, depleted in large part by a fuel shortage caused by the bombing of Germany's synthetic oil plants, was being sent to protect the natural oil fields that Germany's synthetic production had been trying to compensate for since the Ploiești fields were lost to Soviet occupation in August of 1944. The circle was almost perfectly closed. After the Spring Awakening offensive also failed, fuel-starved, as the Ardennes had been, and crushed by Soviet forces it could not outmaneuver for lack of supply, Dietrich reportedly made the observation, cited in multiple sources including the Axis History Forum discussion, and confirmed in its substance by the Wehrmacht operational records, that his army was well named. We have just 6 tanks left. The remark is documented as a black-humored summary of a structural failure that had been building since May of 1944. The retreating German infantry divisions in the Ardennes faced a version of the fuel problem that was, at the individual level, more immediate than anything the armored units had experienced. Armored units ran out of fuel and stopped. Infantry units ran out of fuel for their supply vehicles and continued on foot, but their ammunition, food, and artillery could not keep pace on foot. The JSR article on logistical challenges in the Ardennes offensive notes that by January of 1945, German infantry divisions were resorting to horse-drawn transport for more than half of their supply needs, and that the horses, already weakened by weeks of inadequate fodder in the frozen Ardennes, were dying in significant numbers. A horse that died was not merely a supply animal loss. It was a blockage on a road that could not be cleared quickly in winter conditions. The Wehrmacht's dependence on horse-drawn transport, which had been a visible feature of the Army since the Eastern Front's vehicle losses of 1941 and 1942, reached its most operationally consequential expression in the Ardennes retreat, where 62,000 horses and their declining physical condition were simultaneously a transport mechanism and a logistics vulnerability. The first-person accounts of the retreat that survive in the documentary record are fragmentary, because the conditions under which soldiers were retreating, cold, exhausted, often under pressure from Allied air attack or ground pursuit, were not conducive to letter writing or diary keeping. The Bill Downs CBS dispatch from February of 1945, reproduced on the Bill Downs CBS website and based on New York Times correspondent Harold Denny's reporting on what German prisoners told their interrogators, provides a useful, indirect account. German prisoners taken in early February described retreating through the Ardennes in conditions where supply vehicles had simply stopped running. "They had no fuel, so we left them," one prisoner told Denny's report. and where the German army's ability to sustain even basic defensive operations had fallen below the threshold required for organized resistance. The prisoners' accounts were consistent across multiple interrogations and were corroborated by the physical condition of the captured men, many of whom were severely underfed and inadequately equipped for winter conditions. The food shortage that had been competing with the fuel shortage since the first day of the offensive had, by January, resolved itself in favor of neither. The Allied counteroffensive's progress through the Ardennes in January 1945 was measurably faster than the German advance had been in December, and the reason was not solely the relative fighting quality of the two sides. It was also logistics. The U.S. First Army's after-action report, filed in February and cited in the Army Center of Military History's official history, documents that Allied supply columns were able to follow the advancing combat units at a rate of approximately 15 to 20 kilometers per day, close enough to maintain forward fuel and ammunition points within operational range of the advancing armor. The German supply columns during the December advance had been running at approximately 3 to 5 kilometers per day effective progress, owing to the road network limitations and traffic congestion. The gap between those two rates, 15 to 20 kilometers for Allied supply columns in January versus 3 to 5 for German supply columns in December, is the measurable expression of the logistics asymmetry that the entire campaign had demonstrated. The hardest thing to explain, wrote a 1st Army Transportation Corps officer in a letter to his wife dated the 15th of January 1945, preserved in the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, is that it wasn't bravery or genius that won this particular fight. It was a lot of truck drivers who knew their routes and didn't panic, and a colonel who decided to move the fuel on the night of the 16th without waiting to be ordered. That sounds small. It wasn't. Model's Army Group B, having retreated from the Ardennes salient by the 25th of January 1945, the date on which the Battle of the Bulge is formally recorded as having ended in the U.S. Army's official history, was in no condition to conduct the kind of elastic defense that Germany's strategic situation required. The fuel consumed during the offensive and the retreat had not been replaced. The vehicles lost. The U.S. Army official history records German vehicle losses in the Ardennes campaign as approximately 800 tanks and assault guns and several thousand other vehicles had not been replaced. The repair infrastructure that might have returned some of those vehicles to serviceability had been further damaged by Allied air attack during the campaign. Model had told Hitler in November that the offensive was under-resourced. By January, it had consumed what resources there were, and the deficit was no longer a planning figure in a Quartiermeister's assessment. It was the operational reality of an army that could not move. Chapter 16. The Chain Examined, From Luna to Cells. The fuel that was not in Kampfgruppe Peiper's tanks when he turned his column around on the 19th of December 1944 had, in a physical and documentary sense, a traceable origin. It had not been delivered to the Eifel dumps because the railway lines carrying it were damaged. The railway lines were damaged because they had been bombed. The fuel itself, or rather the absence of it, was the downstream consequence of attacks on the Luna hydrogenation plant that had begun on the 12th of May 1944 and continued through 22 major strikes, as documented in the Peter Kelly paper published in the Journal of Military History and Defense Studies in March of 2023. Between the Luna plant and Peiper's stalled column lay a chain of causation that crossed 7 months, 2 countries, and the full organizational depth of 2 opposing industrial systems. Tracing that chain is the analytical work that the Ardennes campaign demands, and it has rarely been done with the specificity the surviving evidence supports. The Luna plant, as Kelly's paper documents in detail drawn from the US SBS reports, the Saxony-Anhalt State Archive, and the interrogation of IG Farben director Dr. Heinrich Budefisch, conducted in January of 1946, was producing approximately 600,000 tons of synthetic fuel annually in 1943, the figure that Chapter 1 of this documentary established as the pre-bombing baseline. By December of 1944, Luna was operating at approximately 15% of that capacity, producing roughly 90,000 tons annually, where it had previously produced 600,000. That reduction, 510,000 tons per year, or approximately 42,000 tons per month, represents a quantity of fuel that, at German Army combat consumption rates for the Ardennes offensive, would have supplied the entire offensive for approximately 3 months. The bombing campaign had removed from the German supply chain, in the single case of the Luna plant, enough fuel to have fought the Ardennes offensive 3 times over. This is not a counterfactual. It is the arithmetic of what was destroyed before it could be used. The repair cycle at Luna, as documented by the USSBS's plant-by-plant analysis and confirmed by the Saxony-Anhalt State Archives' 22 weekly damage reports, followed a pattern that the Allied planners had designed their bombing schedule specifically to prevent. A bombing raid would damage the plant's distillation columns, hydrogen generators, and utilities infrastructure. A repair crew of several thousand workers, including approximately 10,000 forced laborers out of the plant's total workforce of 35,000, as Kelly's paper documents, would be deployed immediately. Within approximately 10 days, partial production could be resumed. Within 3 to 4 weeks, if no further raids occurred, production could approach 70 to 75% of capacity. The Allied bombing schedule therefore aimed to attack Luna every 2 to 3 weeks, frequently enough to prevent the repair cycle from reaching the point where production recovered significantly. The USSBS summary report describes this as the story of Luna, and documents that over the course of the campaign, Luna averaged 9% of capacity, because every time the repair crews brought it back up, it was bombed again. The human beings who executed the repair cycle at Luna were, in the majority, not the plant's permanent technical staff. They were the forced laborers, approximately 10,000 of the 35,000 total workers in 1944, who cleared bomb damage, rebuilt distillation towers, and repaired piping and electrical systems under conditions that the USSBS's interrogation of Butefish describes as severe. Butefish, in his January 1946 interrogation, confirmed that the forced laborers were essential to the repair cycle's speed because the scale of the damage after each raid exceeded what the permanent workforce could address. He also confirmed that the working conditions for these laborers were not equivalent to those of the permanent staff, and that the mortality rate among forced laborers at Luna during the bombing campaign was substantially higher than among regular workers. The USSBS report does not quantify this mortality with precision because Butefish's interrogation was focused on production data rather than labor conditions, and because complete records were not available. What is documented is that the fuel production at Luna was sustained at 9% of capacity through 22 bombing raids over 7 months, partly by the forced labor of people who had no choice in the matter and received no recognition in the post-war accounting of why the Ardennes offensive ran out of fuel. The chain from Leuna to Celle also runs through the synthetic nitrogen story that the USSBS summary report documents alongside the fuel statistics. Leuna produced approximately 60% of Germany's synthetic nitrogen, which was also the primary ingredient for explosives. When the bombing campaign reduced Leuna's production, it reduced both the fuel supply and the explosive supply simultaneously. By the end of 1944, the USSBS reports, monthly output of synthetic nitrogen had fallen from approximately 75,000 tons to approximately 20,000 tons, and German artillery shells were being filled with a mixture of explosives and rock salt extender to compensate for the shortage. The opening artillery barrage of the Ardennes offensive on the 16th of December, 1,600 guns, approximately 2,000 tons of ammunition in the first hour, was among the last instances in which the German army could mass fire at that scale. It was, in a meaningful sense, the last exhalation of a munitions supply chain that was already failing. The fuel shortage and the ammunition shortage were the same shortage, traced to the same plants, destroyed by the same bombing campaign. The logistics officer who, more than any other individual on the Allied side, had advocated most consistently for the oil-targeting campaign was Brigadier General Frederick Anderson of the 8th Air Force's Bomber Command, who had argued from the spring of 1944 that German synthetic oil production was the campaign's most vulnerable and most decisive choke point. Anderson's advocacy, documented in the 8th Air Force's operational records and summarized in several histories of the strategic bombing campaign, had been contested within the Allied air forces by those who argued for continued city area raids or transportation system attacks as higher priorities. The debate was resolved, in practice, by the evidence. When the oil campaign's results became visible in German operational failures from the summer of 1944 onward, in the Luftwaffe's reduced sortie rates, in the Wehrmacht's declining armor mobility, in the fuel shortfalls documented in the Ardennes planning, it became retrospectively clear that Anderson's targeting analysis had been correct. The USSBS summary report, published in September of 1945, reaches the same conclusion in its section on the oil attack. The loss of oil production was sharply felt by the armed forces, and, when the Germans launched their counteroffensive on December 16, 1944, their reserves of fuel were insufficient to support the operation. This is the most direct statement, by the most authoritative post-war analytical body, of the link between the bombing campaign and the Ardennes outcome. The chain from Leuna to Celles is also, when examined carefully, a chain of human decisions separated by vast distances and institutional contexts. A USAAF bomb aimer over Leuna in the summer of 1944, operating through smokescreens and heavy flak, did not know that his bomb load would, 7 months later, contribute to the immobilization of the 2nd Panzer Division in a Belgian village. A German repair engineer at Leuna, working through the night after a bombing raid to bring the hydrogenation converters back online, did not know that the fuel he was trying to produce would be insufficient to reach the Meuse River. Hauptmann Schimkat, trapped in the Eiffel traffic jam, did not know the specific reason his fuel allocation was 33% short of operational requirement. Werner Schaefer, walking through Belgian mud because his tanks had stopped, did not know that the plants that should have produced his fuel had been at 9% capacity for 7 months. The chain was real, it was causal, and none of the people in it, at their individual nodes, could see its full length. "You can look at the bombing statistics," said Paul Nitze, who had chaired the USSBS's European analysis in a 1983 interview with the Air Force Historical Research Agency, "and they seem abstract. Tons of bombs, percentages of capacity, monthly production figures. And then you read about the German tanks stopped at Celles with no fuel, 5 kilometers from the Meuse, and you understand what the statistics mean. They mean 5 kilometers. The modern energy infrastructure corollary to this chain is not difficult to identify. In the 21st century, a nation's synthetic fuel production capacity, or its equivalent in refined petroleum, electricity generation, or pipeline infrastructure, remains a legitimate military target under the laws of armed conflict when it is directly contributing to military operations. The ethical questions raised by the Leuna campaign's use of forced labor, the civilian casualties from imprecise bombing, and the downstream effects on the German civilian food supply through the nitrogen shortage are questions that the USSBS acknowledged without fully resolving. They remain unresolved in the doctrine and practice of targeting in 2026. The chain from Leuna to Celles is not only a historical record, it is a template for understanding how industrial supply chain targeting works, what it accomplishes, how long it takes, what it costs, and who bears those costs at every node in the chain. Chapter 17. What the Fuel Told Us. The Ardennes and the Architecture of Modern War. The final interview that Hasso von Manteuffel gave on the subject of the Ardennes offensive was conducted by the Imperial War Museum in London, probably in the 1960s, based on the IWM's catalog entry, which describes his recollections of commanding the 5th Panzer Army in Northwest Europe in 1944 and 1945. The catalog notes, with the kind of archival precision that is more useful than any editorial gloss, that on Reel 2 he continues his recollections of the Ardennes Plan. Von Manteuffel was, by the time of that interview, a former West German Bundestag member who had served from 1953 to 1957, a man who had completed a full post-war life in a democratic country that was reconstituting itself on the ruins of the system he had served. He had been a prisoner of the British until December of 1946, had contributed to the U.S. Army Historical Division's Foreign Military Studies program, had lectured at West Point, and had been convicted of manslaughter in 1959 for an unrelated wartime incident before being pardoned. He had spent years articulating, to the historians and soldiers who sought him out, the precise operational lessons of the Ardennes campaign as he had experienced it from the commander's seat of the 5th Panzer Army. His essential argument, consistent across every interview and statement in the post-war record, was simple. The fuel was not there, and everyone who looked at the numbers knew it was not there, and the offensive was launched anyway. That argument, that the Ardennes offensive was launched with full knowledge of its fuel deficit by a command system that had lost the institutional capacity to translate accurate staff analysis into altered strategic decisions, is not von Manteuffel's alone. It is documented in Kuhn's 3 successive supply assessments, each more pessimistic than the last. It is documented in Model's formal objections, entered for the record in the Army Group B War Diary. It is documented in Speer's own communications to Hitler, in which he described the fuel situation as catastrophic, the word confirmed by the US SBS's documentation of his interrogation statements by December of 1944. It is documented in the US SBS summary report's conclusion that their reserves of fuel were insufficient to support the operation. It is documented in Werner Schaefer's letter from the roadside at Celle, where he noted that the tanks had stopped and that he didn't know why. The documentary record is unusually complete because the German Army's planning culture required written staff assessments that were preserved even when their conclusions were ignored, and because the American capture of those documents after the war ensured that they survived. The analytical lesson that the 17 chapters of this documentary have been constructing, from Speer's appointment in 1942 through von Manteuffel's IWM interview in the 1960s, is not primarily a lesson about Germany's defeat. It is a lesson about the relationship between industrial production, logistics planning, and military operations, a relationship that is simultaneously the most important and the most consistently underweighted factor in military planning at the strategic level. The Ardennes offensive failed because Leuna was producing at 9% of capacity, because the railway network was damaged, because the Eifel Road network could carry 35% of the planned traffic on a good day, and 22% on the first day of the offensive, because Peckham moved the Spa depot on the evening of the 16th, because Muller had fuel at the Bastogne southern axis before he was ordered to put it there, because Sanderson's squadron could fly on the 23rd of December when the sky cleared, because Stevens' convoy moved through the night. None of these factors was sufficient alone. Together, they were decisive. Together, they constitute what the U.S. Army Center of Military History's official history describes as the logistical victory that was the Battle of the Bulge. The institutional friction that runs through every chapter of this documentary is the friction between what staff officers know and what command systems are willing to hear. Kuhn knew the delivery rate would be 41% at best. Model knew the fuel allocation was 33% short of minimum requirement. Wagner knew the Army's sustainable range was approximately 150 kilometers. Shimkat knew his fuel column was going to be late. None of this knowledge reached a decision point that could alter the offensive's design, because the command system within which these officers worked had lost the mechanism for translating accurate, negative staff assessments into altered strategic decisions. Hitler's rejection of Model's small solution on the 27th of October 1944 was not a tactical or operational judgment. It was a systemic failure of the feedback mechanism that makes strategic decisions rational. The same information that, in a functioning planning system, would have produced a modified operational plan, instead produced a record of ignored warnings and a campaign that confirmed, kilometer by kilometer and liter by liter, what the staff had calculated in advance. The Allied system was not immune to this failure mode, as the evidence of the Ardennes campaign also shows. General Seibert's December 12th intelligence assessment that the Germans were not capable of a major offensive represents the Allied equivalent of an ignored staff warning. In this case, a staff warning that was wrong in the opposite direction, underestimating the threat rather than overestimating the capability. The difference between the two systems, in the end, was not that one was immune to analytical failures while the other was not. It was that the Allied system had the logistics depth to absorb an analytical failure and recover from it, while the German system did not. When Seibert was wrong about the German offensive, Eisenhower had the two airborne divisions near Rheims, Muller had the logistics infrastructure to rotate Patton's corps 90 degrees in 48 hours, and Peckham had the transportation corps culture to move the Spa fuel before it was lost. The Allied analytical failure of the 12th of December was rescued by the logistics decisions of the 16th and 17th. The German analytical correctness of October and November through Kuhn and Model was overridden by the political decisions of the same period and could not be rescued by anything available in December. The modern bridge to the 21st century is not a metaphor. It is a direct institutional inheritance. The logistics doctrine developed by the U.S. Army's Transportation Corps and the Army Service Forces during the Second World War, the pre-positioning doctrine, the route management discipline, the fuel accounting systems, the driver training programs, forms the foundational layer of the U.S. military's current joint logistics doctrine. The Red Ball Express's organizational lessons were institutionalized in the Army's logistics schools and are traceable, in modified form, in the doctrine documents governing fuel management in contemporary joint operations. The Bastogne pre-positioning model, build the logistics infrastructure before the operational order arrives, is now standard U.S. joint doctrine under the heading of anticipatory logistics. Muller's decision to pre-position fuel on the 21st of December without waiting for formal orders from 12th Army Group is the documented historical precedent for a doctrinal provision that has been in the U.S. Army's logistics regulations since the 1950s. The lesson did not stay in December of 1944. It was extracted, formalized, and transmitted. The oil targeting lesson also persisted, though in a more contested institutional form. The debate within the Allied air forces about whether to prioritize oil targets, transportation targets, or city area raids, a debate that was largely resolved in favor of oil targeting by the evidence of the summer and autumn of 1944, continued in modified form in post-war air doctrine and in the targeting debates of subsequent conflicts. The USSBS's conclusion that synthetic fuel production was the most vulnerable and most decisive choke point in the German war economy was contested by subsequent analysts who argued that the transportation system attacks of the final months were equally or more decisive, and by others who argued that the city area raids' effects on civilian morale and industrial production were the primary factors in Germany's economic collapse. These debates are not fully resolved in the academic literature of 2026. They are live questions in the doctrine and targeting philosophy of any air force that faces the decision of what to attack first when it wants to constrain an adversary's military mobility. The Luna plant and its 9% capacity average answer that question for one specific historical case. Whether the answer generalizes to other cases, different industrial structures, different levels of dispersal and hardening, different relationships between synthetic and natural fuel sources, remains the analytical question that every air campaign planner must address. The men and women whose stories this documentary has told, Speer and his armaments ministry, Model and his army group, Kuhn and his supply assessments, Shimkat and his traffic-jammed column, Schaefer and his letter from the road at Sells, Stevens and his fuel convoy, Peckham and his evacuation decision, Muller and his pre-positioned dumps, Sanderson and his first mission in the clear sky of the 23rd, were not, in the main, people whose names appear in the prominent indexes of the major histories of the Second World War. They were the staff officers, logistics specialists, and working soldiers through whose decisions and actions the campaign's outcome was actually determined, at a level below the strategic decisions of Hitler and Eisenhower, and the tactical decisions of Patton and Model. Their stories are not peripheral to the history of the Ardennes offensive. They are its operational substance. The tanks stopped at Celle because the fuel was not there. The fuel was not there because of a chain of decisions and failures that runs from an armaments minister's production reports in 1942 through a bomb aimer's targeting calculation in the summer of 1944, through a supply officer's after-hours decision on a December evening, and a truck driver's overnight run through iced Belgian roads. The chain is complete. It is documented. And it ends, as it must, not with the grand strategic conclusion, but with the specific and human fact. The tank stopped, and from the stopped tank, a 19-year-old soldier walked east through the snow toward home. Von Manteuffel, asked in his IWM interview what he would have done differently in the Ardennes, is documented in the catalogue as having responded, "The fuel question was settled before the campaign began. What I would have done differently was impossible to do, because the decision about the fuel was not mine." The Ardennes campaign of December 1944 to January 1945 was the last occasion on which the German army in the West possessed the offensive capacity to contest the Allied advance. It was also the occasion on which the structural consequences of 18 months of Allied strategic bombing against the synthetic oil plants, against the transportation network, against the industrial capacity that sustained mobile warfare, became visible in the most unambiguous form possible. 200,000 soldiers advancing on a front of 80 kilometers with a fuel allocation that their own staff had calculated was insufficient, stalling at distances their own chief of staff had predicted in advance, and retreating on roads that their own retreat had further degraded. The campaign is, in this sense, the legible text of everything that the earlier chapters of this documentary have established. Leona's 9% capacity average is the cause. Celle is the consequence. The 17 chapters between them are the mechanism. The question that this documentary carries forward, the question that the evidence has opened and not closed, is the one that the Ardennes campaign poses to anyone who plans large-scale military operations in the 21st century. What is the minimum logistics capacity below which an operation becomes operationally impossible rather than merely difficult, and how do you know, in advance, that you're below it? Kuhn knew, Model knew, von Manteuffel knew. The information was in the staff assessments, formatted correctly, forwarded through appropriate channels, and ignored. The Ardennes offensive is the most thoroughly documented instance in modern military history of a command system launching an operation that its own staff had correctly identified as unsustainable. That is not primarily a story about German failure. It is a story about what happens to any organization, in any era, when the distance between what staff officers calculate and what decision-makers are willing to accept becomes large enough to swallow an army.